So I'm working on that.
We're going to talk about practical wisdom. I forgot the name that begins with a P. You're
Phronesis.
explaining it, phronesis, because you had two different interpretations.
Yes.
And I was confused about those two different interpretations.
Well, understandably, the typical definitions of these things are not helpful at all. There's some words, and let me see what's left. Is that everything? Oh, where health lies. Right. Okay. This set. Here we go. This is where we left off.
My latest clash with Les, I was suggesting that perhaps in year 12 to perhaps have a unit on philosophy, and probably the Republic would be a good choice. And he told me that the Republic was sexist, racist, totalitarian, and not suitable for children. I sat there for about half an hour and I thought, hang on.
Well, we're adults here. We can handle it.
Where was the sexism and racism in the Republic? I can't recall it. I do remember a section on the Socrates, some ideal government, which you could interpret as totalitarian, I suppose.
We could talk about totalitarian or sexist, but racist really doesn't fit the Greeks very well. They're bigots about their language and religion, but not a whole lot else. They're
He
like,
went on to say that, yes, the Greeks were racist, sexist, and totalitarian, therefore not worth studying.
well, I mean, if we're excluding everybody who has significant flaws, there's not a lot of people left to study because we're no treats either. It's like we kind of
Well, until you study them, Steve, how do you know all these things about them?
yeah, exactly. Right.
After I raised a bit of a complaint, a few other people corrected him and said, yeah, you sure you're right about that? And I said, you sound like you're confusing him with Aristotle or something like that. And seemed to be somewhere along those lines. And
Yeah.
Les assumes he's a know-it-all, so he has to be right every time. And
Yes. Well, it's like people divide character by character into those who want to settle questions, and once they feel they have settled them, they never, ever, ever, ever want to think about them again. And if anybody dares to try to think about them, they slap them down and no, I have decided. I will tell you the truth. I'm a prophet of the truth, and you can stop thinking now. Just accept my answers. And I'm like, wow, you're the kind of person that the Catholic Church was worried about in the Middle Ages when they said maybe we should leave the Bible in Latin. Because, if you read examples of prophets, you're going to run off and think, well, maybe I'm a prophet. Maybe everybody should listen to me. It's a natural thing. I know people who are exactly like you're saying, Stephen. They want everybody to say the words they say as the absolute truth, and they cannot stand to have people question them. It's like, I've settled this. Let's move on. It's like, no, it doesn't matter if you've settled it. The rest of us would like to think about it too.
There are relatively few authors that would benefit one from continual rereading over one's lifetime. And Plato happens to be one.
Yeah.
There are others. He's not totally unique, but you've still got maybe 100 people out of millions, billions. It's a short list. I myself have changed the way I read Plato countless times. And that reminds me, since we've been talking about the underworld, I was going to check it. A little known fact, the Republic begins, I went down to the Piraeus, and it uses the same Greek words as Homer did when Odysseus went down to Hades. And it's Cata bene, to go down. I went down.
Yes.
And there are some pretty interesting interpretations of the Republic that take that as the key, that this is Socrates' descent into hell, or
Right.
not into hell, into the underworld, not to, but into the underworld. And so it's not expected to be a pleasant trip that yields a lot of progress.
Yes. Yes. And, it's exactly, go ahead, Stephen.
There seems to be a lot of people who seem to believe that the cosmos should dance to their tune.
Right. Right.
And the question is, I think, well, a lot of people want the universe to dance to their tune because they don't want to change themselves.
Right.
It's far more convenient, the entire universe dance to their tune.
Or so they think.
Than work on themselves.
Yes. Yes. Which is evidence that they've never read or understood Greek tragedy, where it's all about, the problem is when you're in a state of tragic inversion, the worst thing in the world that can happen is for you to exert your powers because they all work exactly against you instead of for you. It's the urge to be in charge, that so many people have. It just shows a deep want of understanding of how character works.
Okay, this chapter mentioned the sophistry. I suppose it was pointing out the sophistry of the rulers. What were they calling them? Sophists. Yes, saying that the rulers were engaging in sophistry, and this is something to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this particular chapter is starting to sound a bit like the Western world at the moment, with a lot of egos who figure they've got their place in the sun lined up. And where is it? Give it to me.
Yes. Yes. I love the fact that one of Heraclitus's early fragments is listening not to me, but to the Logos. It is wise to acknowledge that all things are one. So right off the bat, he's saying, it doesn't matter what my opinion is, just like it doesn't matter what your opinion is. Opinions are terrible. If only we didn't have any opinions. It's the thing that separates us from reality is, he also says that people fail to see the divine because of their incredulity. They already know, they think, what's true and what's not true. So when they're confronted with sacred truths, they disregard them. It's like, I don't need to think about that. I've already settled that. He's talking about these same issues that Stephen's dealing with this guy he's talking to. And this is 2,500 years ago. He's saying there is this thing in people that wants to put on the crown of a prophet or of nature or of God and say, behold my mighty mind and my mighty opinions. And Heraclitus, meanwhile, right out of the gate is saying, no, our opinions are the worst part of us. The important thing is this shared nature and how it works. We should be studying what's actually out there because it's managed to create all of this around us. And it's astonishing. The act of the fecundity, the creativity of nature dwarfs our efforts to mimic it. When we create things, they don't last very long. One of the three criteria of mortality that the lyric poets are concerned about. So, we should. I was just looking at in my my little word hoard here. Zen kata fusin. Zen kata. Let me paste that in there. Zen kata fusin. Live according to nature. Live according to nature. And of course, if you remember the other statement that phusis is to cosmos as the psyche is to the somos, that is to say, the flow and the meaningful, logical, sacred flow of nature that explains why it does things is related to the physical object of the universe in the same way our own psyche or soul is related to our body, right? It's got all the understanding. It's got the parts that bring it to life. It's got the parts that matter. So this doesn't say, live according to the universe. It says live according to that soul of the universe, which, as Heraclitus says, by which all things are steered through all things. What is the underlying logic? What is the hidden harmony that makes this all go? That's what we should be living according to. And this is a widespread statement, Zen kata fusin. You see it in Greek literature from time to time. But as moderns, we just read right past it. We don't know what the hell they're talking about. The whole idea that we've got a problem and we need a model to emulate to help replace the missing phronesis that our species doesn't have, this idea is alien to moderns. So anytime we're confronted with it, we can't read it. We can't see it. We replace the meaning of the writer with what we would rather he had said.
Well, the principle of the axial age, I suppose if you look at it, you get Taoism teaches balance. And it teaches this balance has a certain dynamic to it. But we seem to be living in an age which is forgetting the concept of balance.
Yes. Yes, the Greek term dike, which is often just translated as justice, in his other book, his first book, From Religion to Philosophy by Cornford, he argues that dike is far more profound a concept than what moderns mean by justice. I mean, our concept of justice is you break the law, you get punished at the end. That's it. You don't have to make anything better, right? It doesn't matter whether the universe is made a better place. All that matters is, I get to hurt you every time I catch you doing something wrong. So, don't get in trouble. This is modern justice. But their concept of decay, Cornford argues, is closer to the Tao, like Stephen is talking about. Is what is the flow of the cosmos that makes things work? And how do we hook our caboose to that train instead of hooking it to idiots who lead us over cliffs and into minefields? Now, how can we arrange human affairs so that we're following models that lead to greater vitality and health instead of to self-destruction, catastrophe, and tragedy? Ate is a term that is used constantly in Greek tragedy. And ate, which we'll come to anon, it means, it has two completely different meanings, except they're not all that, as we'll see, they're very related. And one of the definitions of ate is blindness, by which they don't mean physical blindness, but they mean like looking right at the universe and not seeing it. The Oedipus is looking right at his problem and he can't see it until very late in Oedipus Tyrannus. It's just not visible to him. It doesn't do any good to be the smartest, cleverest guy, in Thebes, because he's looking from a human perspective, and human perspectives are narrow. So the part that his unconscious has chosen to push into the background and not bring to his consciousness is where all the meaning of his situation lies. And this is the tragic flaw that afflicts all of Homo sapiens. Oedipus is all of us. He's not some weird pervert who, we can snicker about in junior high class when we're reading Greek tragedies. He's all of us. It's just as bad when we go awry, because we don't see that either. If we take fracking waste and we're not sure what to do with it because it's so poisonous, and if we take it with us, the EPA will be all over us saying, well, God, you can't have this poison. You have to dispose of it in these expensive ways. We say, well, I thought of a cheap alternative. I'll just flush it into aquifers. I'll just shove it down into aquifers that hold clean water deep down in the earth, because we don't need clean water, right? That's not important. And, it won't stay there forever. It'll come out in centuries or millennia, but I'll be dead and my company will be gone by then. And so I don't care, because I don't have to pay the price. Only our descendants for thousands of years to come will pay the price of having all their clean water full of carcinogenic bullshit. But that's okay, because I, look at my quarterly profits. This level of failure to understand, where is the mark for health? What is it that our species should be doing if we want to be a going concern, if we want to succeed and thrive and be healthy in the long term? To the Greeks, this is what phronesis is about. To go back to Sharon's question and bring us full circle to last week. Phronesis is that faculty that the cheetah has that makes the cheetah pay attention to everything that's important to a healthy cheetah way of life. It is an ability to think about the world in exactly those terms that lead to a healthy life. And it's what's missing in us. It has to be cultivated in us. And if it's not cultivated in us, we can be obsessed over anything, including things that destroy us. Like, are my quarterly profits high enough? Did they grow compared to last quarter so that I don't get in trouble? I don't want to get in trouble. It doesn't matter what I destroy or how much I wreck the universe, as long as I don't get in trouble. That's the important part, right? To us, to moderns, it's the only value system we really have.
Which doesn't nature sort of evolve to correct these things or to adjust to the things that mankind may be doing to destroy it? I can't see that nature would just sit back and let mankind destroy it completely without adjusting itself to some of those things that you just mentioned. I mean, cheetahs don't create cars or any of this sort of thing. They just do the same thing over and over and over, whereas mankind does not. So I'm kind of having a difficult time thinking that nature's just going to kick back while mankind does all these horrifying things without itself evolving.
Right. I mean, you're right on the money, right? That's what when you ask that question, you're expressing the ancient worldview, right? Because the modern worldview is the universe is just a stupid, meaningless pile of stuff, and we can do whatever we want, and then it stays the way we left it. But the ancient worldview is the universe, the cosmos, is an organism, and it has, it has the capacity to, in fact, it has the character that makes it respond to everything. It's constantly sensing and responding. But the problem is, it may sense and respond in ways that are anathema to us. So its response might be, well, then you go extinct. Maybe you take 7,000 species with you, but at the end of it, you're gone, and I don't have a problem anymore. And examples of that are, when the early bacteria that were once, and archaea that were once the dominant life form on this planet, they produced oxygen as a waste byproduct. And oxygen was poisonous to them. I mean, deadly toxic poisonous. It's poisonous to us too. Our body has enormous complex systems to try to manage oxygen because it's an explosive, flammable, element. It's extremely unstable. So our kind of organism has enormous numbers of systems that are entirely designed to scrub free oxygen from the body and keep it from reacting randomly with the walls of our blood cells or our neurons or all the other things we'd rather not have chemical reactions with out of control. But we had to evolve that stuff. So the early life on this planet didn't have any of that. And for it, oxygen was a toxic byproduct. But it didn't care because the atmosphere was huge. And these were tiny single-celled organisms. And, they could emit oxygen and it would disappear into the great ocean of water and be diluted and never really trouble them much. The problem was when they succeeded to such an extent that they basically terraformed the entire planet into something poisonous to themselves. And there was a mass die-off. It's one of the great extinctions. There was a mass die-off. And now, anaerobic bacteria and archaea can be found on the planet, but only in weird locations, like in mud flats, under the mud, in sediments at the bottom of the ocean. You can find them, in these kinds of borderline crevice areas because they accidentally made the rest of the planet, inhospitable to them. And so this was nature's response. Nature's response is, okay, those of you that have the capacity to evolve into something that can manage oxygen will be the inheritors of the planet. And those of you who used to be the dominant form of life on the planet are now going to be the weird curios. People dig up the mud and go, what is that stench? Oh, look, it's anaerobic bacteria. How weird. So we don't, there's a couple of ways to respond to this. I mean, the Greek response is as follows. It says, the cosmos doesn't care if we survive or not. It's not of any particular concern. They set us in motion. It's up to us to figure things out or not figure things out. The cosmos will go on, no matter how bad the damage is that we do to this planet, the large lump of rock is going to survive. Even if we exterminated every other form of life on the planet and reduced it to Mars, the planet would still be circling the sun and the sun wouldn't notice and blah, blah, blah. Most likely we can't exterminate all life on the planet. And we would just do a lot of damage. A lot of species would go extinct. And more importantly, we would undercut the foundations for our own ability to survive on the planet. We fantasize ourselves being infinitely adaptable, but no species is infinitely adaptable. We all have niches that we've evolved to manage. Homo sapiens is more flexible than most, but not infinitely flexible. So it's kind of like the relationship that the ancient Greeks had to their deities. Right? Poseidon isn't a great Santa Claus in the ocean who gives you gifts if you pray to him. This is a more of a medieval concept that if you want good things to happen, you have to try to appease the angry god, and maybe he'll give you a gift. Poseidon and those others, I mean, you could find people who tried to worship that way in the ancient world, but in general, the point of keeping track of a deity like Poseidon is he's a large elephant stomping around, and you're a mouse in the grass, and as long as you know where the elephant is, he doesn't step on you. You learn to arrange your life in such a way that you're never under his feet. And if he's going somewhere that you want to go, maybe you can hitch a ride, but not if you stand in the path of his footprints. So they had this relationship with their deities of, they're neither good nor evil, but they're big, powerful things that we need to harmonize with if we know what's good for us. And so their perspective when it comes to humanity and the foolishness and the way we treat nature is, either we learn to harmonize with nature or nature's going to step on us. These are pretty much what history teaches us. And either of those options, either we get our act together and we learn to live in a better way, or we don't get our act together and we get stepped on. Nature is equally happy either way. Nature's got a bigger picture to worry about than what some naked apes are doing on this planet. They might be sad. They might write sad songs and poems about us afterwards, but they kind of would like us to clue in. And that's what the very first thing you see when you walk into Delphi is know thyself. Hello, wake up, look around, figure out what's going on. You need to pay attention. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you're off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it seems to me there's kind of a problem in this sense. I mean, we are beings as smart as we are with limited capacities to know things. And the universe or the earth is well, if not infinite, it's very, very large. Let's put it that way. And so therefore there's always mystery within that. Now, if we have a soul that's attuned to that, I suppose there's a couple possibilities. One is that we live with a certain degree of ambiguity and do the best we can, which means we have to be very careful about what we do. So we make minimum mistakes. I guess that's a concept of, of moderation. The other thing is that we could harmonize, which is not exactly getting to know the things, but somehow attune ourselves, which in some ways is also not knowing. It's just sort of kind of like what Beethoven says, like the harmony gives us a gateway to understanding that we do not understand, but that which understands us. That's another way. Another way is that somehow our soul is somehow have a kind of subconscious, unconscious. It sort of knows. And it's a question of dragging this unknowing into the knowing world. And somehow, no, now I understand, So unless you think of somebody like Jung versus Freud, I mean, you're always dealing with the subconscious because that's a deeper pool of knowledge that's embedded in the race. But you don't know it. You're just kind of an ignorant guy. You're living in psychosis or neurosis, and then maybe these small truths surface and say, oh, this is why I'm screwed up the way I am. So that's another way. It just seems to me that's why I kind of like Heidegger in one sense. I don't completely like him. Obviously, he's a Nazi, but he said Dasein is not the know of truth, but a disclosure of truth, which means bits and pieces at a time. Disclosure means it's not complete. There's always a hidden part. And so you'll never cross the divided line. You're always staring into the horizon, which I suppose is a divided line. And so how do we deal with the situation? Now, another way is, I guess, you invent smart instruments that can measure things and you get it more precise rather than, well, generally it's like this, just be cautious, and you have these measurements. And I'm not sure if measurements is the bearer of truth. Yeah, I think in some cases certainly is. Other cases, it's a farthest from it because you become diluted with the measurements themselves. So in some sense, we're always in a slippery slope, so to speak. We're trying to climb up the hill, but I guess the gods have dumped a bunch of grease on it. And we can't cling on to things very well. So I think we're just left in a funny position. It's like choose what position you're going to be in terms of a kind of knowing, but a kind of not knowing. I mean, that's kind of where we are at. And it just seems to me, I suppose you could say that we're smarter than any animal in a sense because we have a kind of way of anticipating things. They just do the same old thing and they get used to what it is. But if something suddenly change, for instance, there's oxygen in the air now, we're all going to die. They just keep doing the same thing. I don't know what we do. Maybe we invent something that could detoxify that, or maybe we, find some way to gene edit us so that we become this new thing that actually thrives at oxygen. I don't know. It just seems like you can't solve the problem. You're always living in this quagmire in a funny way. So that's not a real comfortable place to be either. But I guess that's the way it is. That's sort of what the Tao says, The Tao that is knowable is unknowable. The Tao that's speakable is unspeakable. And the Tao De, which is try to understand, in other words, institutionalize, somehow concretize, practicalize it. And the De is where the problem is. And the Ching is how do you go from the path through the De to the Tao? That the practical manifestation of what you generally have a feeling about and how it actually is, that's a problem. So we end up building these tools and civilizations that always are not complete, but they kind of do okay for a short while, and then you get into something else. So I guess I don't know. It's much more problematic than just say, your soul understands. It doesn't understand. It just sort of understands a kind of morass that you have to deal with. Unless you believe in Jung. I suppose, like the great mythic structure.
Yeah. There was something I wanted to share. Oh, I guess it's too long. Look at that. I guess I'm sharing it right now. We'll figure it out. Yeah, I got to throw the clock back on. I'm being bad. So Shakespeare, Macbeth, it opens with the scene with the witches who are speaking. That famous opening line, "When shall we three meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain?" And near the end of that opening, there's a sequence near that dialogue reaches to all of them saying together, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air." And my high school, this is Richard Poole I'm talking about. You guys won't know him. He's a whole generation or two or three generations of people who grew up in the Pacific Northwest ended up studying English literature under him. And he never got famous for anything, and he never wrote anything down. But he approached literature from a very odd perspective. And one of the ideas that he taught me is the concept of tragic inversion, which I'm having a devil of a time finding on the internet or anywhere else. When people use the phrase tragic inversion, they use it to mean something unfortunate happened. It's like, oh, he wanted to win, but instead he lost. What a tragic inversion. And Richard Poole will be like, sweet Jesus, that's not a tragic inversion. That's just unfortunate. Tragic inversion is the state of affairs in a tragedy during which your virtues all turn into vices, in which it's bad to be powerful, because when you exert your power to do what you think is the right thing, you instead do the wrong thing. And you can't, there are two aspects to tragic inversion that are critical. One of them is that you don't know what's happening. You think that things are going fine. You think that the problems that are accumulating in your life came from somewhere else. Something else must have caused them. Because after all, you're a good person. You do good things. And therefore, when you act in the world, it must be successful. So there must be something working against you. Perhaps some enemy you could search out and find. And if you kill them or imprison them, then your efforts will work again. So there's this kind of mindset that happens that builds up around the combination of on the one hand having your virtues act as vices, and on the other hand being entirely unaware that that's the cause of things going wrong. It's like you're digging a hole, and your problem is that you're in a hole, and you think that the solution is, I should just I'm going to make a steam shovel that can dig 10 times as fast as I've been digging. I'm going to, you keep adding to your power to be able to dig more and more effectively, never figuring out that the problem is that the reason you're in a hole is because you're digging a hole. And the first thing you need to do to stop the state of affairs is stop digging. But as Nietzsche says, man would rather will the void than be void of will. He'd rather be in charge, doing the wrong thing and wrecking his life, than have to give up control, because so many people are terrified of not being in control. Like the guy Stephen was talking about, who absolutely can't let us talk about an idea because he thinks he's already decided what it all means. And if you all start questioning it, he gets this existential dread that he can't explain and can't acknowledge. He can only lash out at people who are trying to continue the conversation. So this is the tragic state, when you don't know why your efforts aren't working, and you don't see the extent to which the reason they're not working is the efforts themselves are causing the problem. You're making it worse when you think you're making it better, and then you're failing to connect the dots because you have an entirely backwards perspective. So fair is foul and foul is fair. That's Shakespeare's statement of the tragic inversion in action, right? So, we studied Macbeth in high school from this perspective of tragedy. He had to study that. He had to study Oedipus. He had to study Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in which there's a similar inversion. What is civilized and what is savage and primitive? And the Europeans invading Africa in Heart of Darkness, they think the Africans are savage and primitive and that they're civilized. But what Joseph Conrad shows over and over is the ways in which the efforts of the European people to civilize and tame the continent are making everything worse. And he's got all these kinds of moments and scenes and turns of language that are all designed to show the tragic inversion that's happening, in which the Europeans can't see that the problems that they're experiencing in Africa are largely caused by themselves. Well, and their efforts to make things better. There's moments in Heart of Darkness where he describes, I don't know if it's a Jeep or truck that's been overturned and is rusting, baking in the sun with its wheels helplessly turned up towards the sky. And it's like, on the one hand, it's supposed to be, modern, fabulous European technology for conquering the continent. But on the other hand, it's lying there like a dead animal, and as he uses the turn of phrase to make it seem like a helpless dead animal. He's constantly inverting your expectations to show that it is the power and the character problems, the worldview problems that the people are bringing with them to Africa that are causing the bad outcomes. But because they're in a state of tragic inversion, they can't possibly imagine it or believe it. So they just keep doing what they're doing and making things worse. And of course, Apocalypse Now famously, tries to adapt Conrad's novel and place it in Vietnam. People walk away from that film going, wow, it was... Say that again?
I have an argument against that. about tragic inversion and the way you describe it. I'm going to bring up Gordon Gekko
Yes.
of Wall Street. In other words, if that's true, one of the things about the Greeks, and I guess any good society, is that you have a degree of harmony between the individual and the polis in some way. Okay, that doesn't mean that you couldn't live a good life. It's just that there's kind of a harmony, which means you have to care about the city, about its citizens, at least to some degree. If you see that has built into a structure of its own, the tragic inversion could turn against itself. In other words, you do something, you know it's going to invert and cross tragedy, but it's going to spill over to other people in society, and you're going to live in a gated community. I mean, like, it seems like everything is good. Greed is good. I mean, like, too bad you guys are living under a bridge, but I live in a gated community. So that's an inversion. It certainly brings tragedy to the society, but you're fine. And if it gets really bad, you just move to France or something. It's like I think we have not so much turned against nature as we have turned against ourselves, in the sense that you don't really care about others to that degree. We might care about them to snake oil them into thinking that greed is good, So in some sense, it's like, I think that's what we're living in. So you're taking a tragedy, you're turning into a small comedy for yourself. But yeah, the tragedy, the rest of society is, as Shakespeare puts it, that is still in play. But you don't care. If you do not have the sense of care, then in a sense, that doesn't mean anything because you don't care about others. So yeah, turns into a dark comedy. I would call it that way, not a tragedy.
Yeah, I
So
agree. And the Greeks would agree, and Kenneth Smith would agree on this. This issue is exactly what Kenneth's writing about up above in that paragraph when he's talking about that there are types that the Greeks character types the Greeks believe to be corrupted, and one of the core features of that corrupted personality. I've been focusing on phronesis and soprasune and the lack of it, which is a form of corruption. But one of the ways you see that is with this idea that it's okay to prey on others and their misery as long as you personally don't immediately notice any downside to what you're doing. There's a pair of terms that I'm gonna actually let me chuck. I'm gonna chuck 5 terms in quick succession at you that are related here. But the 2 critical ones I'll post now. One of them is philia, and the other one is nekos. And what's important about philia and nekos is that they're opposites, and to the Greeks, they're seen as the critical balance of forces that holds a polis together or tears it apart. It's like, what is it that under what conditions does a polis hold together and be a viable living city state in which people support each other and take care of each other? And to what are the conditions under which a polis self-destructs? Stasis, they called it, civil war. When does a polis rip itself to pieces? And they abstracted this. Hi, Joe, welcome. And hi, Ginny. They abstracted this by contrasting philia, which is a social mood or a cultural mood that says, you know what, I like it when we get together and work together and solve problems together and make things better for us as a group. I like that. If I like that feeling, what I'm experiencing is philia. And this is very different from the Christian definition where they were talking about, the different kinds of love. This is an ancient idea. And this ancient idea of philia is, and now I'm going to go back to Stephen's comments from 2 years ago, this is a centripetal force. It pulls inward, it pulls the group together and holds it together. And they saw nekos as the centrifugal force. That's when the feeling that's spreading is a feeling that it's not worth it. These other people don't matter to us, or we might be actively hostile to them. And we feel like we'd be better off if we split the group and stopped being grouped together. And the Greeks were always looking at their own history from the perspective of trying to figure out which was the dominant force within a given polis. Were they afflicted with nekos, or were they blessed with philia? And in this is sort of another way of expressing this idea that the polis itself has a character, just like every other grouping of human beings, from the individual all the way up to the species as a whole, has a character. And is that character eudaimonic, so that it leads to greater health and vitality for the organism? Or is it dysdaimonic, in which case the character is causing the natural awareness and actions of that organism to tear itself to pieces, self-destruction. And so tragedy is the story of dysdaimonia. And if it's at the level of a polis, it's the story of nekos. How does a polis wreck itself? Seven Against Thebes, right? The story that is the prequel to Antigone, which we were talking about a few weeks ago. Now, that's a story about nekos. It's about how Cleon's attempt to punish the Seven Against Thebes who besiege the city by not allowing them to be buried is actually tearing the city apart, because people's bonds to their own family, if you interfere with that, if you try to say, well, your bonds to me as your ruler should be more important than your bond to your own family, the ruler is kidding himself if he thinks that's going to work. 9 times out of 10, it won't. He's basically setting up the city-state to split. He's creating nekos through that, quote, punishment that he's trying to inflict. It's not actually doing what he thinks it's doing. He thought it would pull the polis together by separating the bad guys from the good guys. But in Seven Against Thebes, the problem is that some of us think that some of us are bad guys. So that perception, the one king who doesn't, in the story of Seven Against Thebes, the two brothers are supposed to alternate years for who rules, and one of them decides he doesn't want to give it up. And that's what causes the civil war. And that selfishness and that lack of concern for the long-term perspective, it drives a wedge into the polis. Using Phil's Set terminology, here's Set, right? He thinks, if I just fission off the bad part, my brother, then I get everything I want. I get to be in charge. But instead, he sets in motion a whole series of catastrophes that cause Thebes to splinter and fragment and weaken. So these are critical things. These all hover around this concept of phronesis and soprasune. Do you know which direction health and vitality for the organism lies, or do you not? And if you don't know, how are you supposed to find out? And what happens to you? And there's the middle of the 3 terms that I posted there, hamartia, missing the mark. When you aren't aiming properly at the center of the target of health and vitality, when you miss the mark, you create that delta that you create is full of charge. And that charge can take the form of story. Maybe I have to go through a series of events before I can restore things. A simple story of heroism, or it can take the form of a tragedy in which I'm trying to do the right thing, but because I'm pointed in the right direction, when I succeed in going the direction I'm pointing in, I actually miss the mark and make things worse. That's the tragic inversion, right? I'm failing due to my success. My success is causing a failure. Or, as Phil pointed out, maybe I'm not even trying to do the right thing. Maybe I just don't care. And now, according to the Greeks, that's not even a tragedy. That's a comedy. Comedies are about people lower than we are behaving in the appalling ways that sometimes it's hard to believe people, behave in. And it too misses the mark, but it's not even trying to hit the mark. Stephen, come off and tell us about what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, looking at Spengler, and of course Spengler would have a huge variety of critics, and they're probably right. But his whole point about this is the decline of the West. And he's not saying the end of the West. He's saying this is the beginning of a decline. And I'd always looked at things from the perspective of the Anglo-Saxon cultures of America, you know, Australia, or Britain, and the insubstantial one, Canada. And I could see, I was starting to wonder, it looks like there's trouble. 20 years ago, I started to see that the Anglo-Saxon culture, which I thought of as Western, was reaching the Gracchi brother stage. And I thought, well, so many years, and I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't conceive of it, that the culture I'd understood and grown up in would get into a sort of a civil war. But the historical examples were there. And I thought the historical example is probably right. So I thought, you know, when the year 2030 comes along, or 2040, there'll be clear signs of a civil war in this America or something like that. And it seems to have happened a bit quicker than I expected. But I've realised now that that idea, I thought I was so clever at the time. Now it's a very widely spread belief about the similarity with the Gracchi. But then I discovered in recent times that Spengler was saying the same thing 100 years ago. And I realise now that that breakdown in Western culture, that falling of the bottom out of society, showed up on the continents of Europe before it hit the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons are there and looking at Europe in World War I and World War II and thinking, you know, what a pack of fools you are. But the same disease seems to be catching up with the Anglo-Saxons now. So it started on the continent over 100 years ago. But for us European Anglo-Saxons, which are a bit further out on the periphery, it's now caught up with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So there's this critical pair of terms, gnome and tuche, which Cornford in Thucydides Mythhistoricus says. Thucydides uses, he says, all outcomes of human affairs are determined by, and he doesn't use the word, but he means a dialectic, a dynamic system between gnome and tuche, where gnome is our agency, our ability to affect our own outcomes, our ability to, you know, through any means, whether it's cultivating ourselves to do better so that we gain the ability, whether it's working together, whether it's working alone, you know, how do we exert our will to bring about the outcomes we want? And tuche, which is fortune, or in Joe's term, contingency. And late moderns tend to think in the same way that late ancients do, which was where we see fortune as maybe being a way to solve our problems. Like gambling addictions are widespread. You get people who blow every cent they have eventually at, they go to places and gamble, and they gamble away what they've got because they're hoping that luck will come to the rescue. They want fortune to be their friend. And the ancients make very clear, and repeatedly, but especially in the Peloponnesian War, where Thucydides actually puts it in the mouths of the Spartans, tuche is never your friend. When tuche gives you a good outcome, the worst thing in the world you can do is to think that it was for your benefit. Because what it is it's tempting you into overreach. It's tempting you into hubris and eros and all of the other things that lead to destruction. It's easy to see why tuche can be bad when it's bad fortune. Oh, my basement flooded. Nobody wants that. That's bad fortune. But good fortune is sometimes worse. The Spartans are saying it's why you have to be magnanimous in victory. You don't know how much of your victory was luck, and you never, ever want to lean on luck, because nobody has good luck. Luck is a wheel. The wheel will always turn, and the worst thing you can do is be propping yourself up on it when it turns and drops you, because then you were unguarded, right? We go back to that aphylactos. The mistake is to think that 2K isn't coming for you, and when it is. And Cornford's argument is that Aeschylus sees 2K as one of the, he says Aeschylus sees 2K as one of the very most important ways that people are tempted into tragedy. There's a short list of 2 or 3, and we'll get to those. There's a short list of 2 or 3 most prominent ways that people are corrupted. And one of them is 2K. Because 2K in the outward form always seems to be offering you from time to time these great gifts, if only you'll stretch out your hand. So Athens stretch out their hand for Syracuse and loses the entire war, for example. I mean, that's Thucydides' argument. So what I'm talking about here is I'm taking us back to these 3 terms: peripeteia, meaning reversal; hamartia, meaning missing the mark; and anagonoresis, which means discovery or recognition. All of these are terms that Aristotle and others use when they're talking about the structure of Greek tragedy. And so, for example, Aristotle talks about how glorious it is when the moment of tragic reversal and the moment of tragic discovery are the same moment. It's why he says Oedipus Tyrannus is one of the greatest of all tragedies. He says, because Oedipus is felled in one blow, in a sudden moment, when he finally sees the whole picture. And in that moment, he's ruined through the act of discovery. And Aristotle says, what a feeling that causes in the audience. I mean, it's amazing how much that makes people empathize. It just totally grabs you. So when people talk about, in the rare occasions when people talk about tragic inversion, they mistake it for peripeteia. Right? Peripeteia is a function of 2K. It is the wheel always turns. Sooner or later, whether you have good fortune, it'll turn to bad. If you have bad fortune, it'll turn to good. Something is always going to come along that's going to surprise you. 2K is the daimon of surprises. Surprises even the deities, but certainly surprises mortals, especially. And so reversal, if you will, is the primary function of 2K, not to make things good or to make things bad. When a civilization is decaying, like late antiquity or late modernity, people feel so powerless and frustrated that they start desperately wanting to redefine 2K as either good or bad, right? Because they want to find out who's lucky and attach themselves to those people. Or they want to find out what's a lucky thing that I could do. They get into good luck charms. The rise of astrology happened in the Alexandrian period, which is late in the Greek period. Before that, they were a lot more concerned with trying to cultivate character, so that you might be born with an unlucky character, but if you cultivated it, you could maybe turn it into a better character, and maybe your outcomes would be better. And likewise, if you're investing in the world around you, like your polis, maybe if your polis has a bad character so that it's constantly interfering with your attempts to do good things, you can cultivate the polis into having a better character. Especially if you work with other people and together there's enough of you and you can transform the polis. And then now contingency isn't working against you quite as often, or at least not from so close at hand, right, from your own polis. So this idea of look at the structure of your problems and figure out where the change needs to happen, and then invest in making that change, you can change your fate, especially if you're not blind to the contribution of your own character, your own family's character, your tribe's character, your clan's character, your polis's character, and so on. But by the time you get to the late antiquity, people are like, no, that doesn't work. They tried to do that for centuries and it was a disaster. We give up, right? What Gilbert Murray calls the loss of nerve. Let's just hope that somebody saves us. Gilbert Murray argues that's why Greece turned to Christianity so wholeheartedly. Christianity offered salvation and they wanted it. They're like, we have wrecked everything. We not only did it once in the ancient heroic age of the Bronze Age, we then taught everybody absolutely not to repeat those mistakes. And then we repeated those mistakes and wrecked everything again. We can't be trusted. They lost faith in the idea that human beings could fix their own problems. And Gilbert Murray argues that's why they were absolutely receptive. Why more than anywhere else, at that moment when they're first presented with the gospel of salvation, they're really excited. Oh, thank God. Good news. You can be saved. And they're like, well, if anybody needs saving, it's us because we wrecked everything. Right? We don't want to be responsible. We want somebody else to fix this for us. We want to put our affairs in the hands of the gods. Because when they're in our hands, it's just tragedy and comedy. We just wreck everything. So all of this, which we're going to get to soon, right? We're coming up on the medieval section after we finish H. All of this is being driven by these concerns about character and fortune, agency and contingency. What are the chances to be able to make your life better or not make your life better, and so forth. So this fundamental issue of tragic inversion, despite the fact that nobody writes about it and nobody talks about it, and if they do, they confuse it with peripeteia or merely bad luck. This is the core issue that the ancients have when they're thinking about the issues of tragedy and where are the catastrophes that come from the limitations of human character. They say it's that when you are missing the mark, when you are not aiming in the right direction, it would be better if you were passive or ineffectual than if you were active and effectual, because your powers are moving in the wrong direction. You're going to make things wrong while you think you're making things better. And thus you end up, the state of tragic inversion is how people, are hoist on their own petard. The bitter spice to go with the tragedy, right? It's like, God, this all sucks. Yeah, but you did it to yourself. No, I do not want to have done this to myself. Of all the things I didn't want to do, it was this. So I don't want to hear that I made any of this happen. And it's easier. It's far more popular. You certainly see it in the modern world. It's far more popular to say, none of this is my fault. Right? And the Greeks aren't saying all of it's your fault. You find people who claim that that's the truth, that it's all in your positive attitude and your get up and gumption, and that's not true either. The Greeks didn't believe either of those things. They thought it was a dynamic system in which agency and contingency are pushing and pulling on each other. It's a complicated shifting, not balance, not compromise, but what do you? I mean, it's a peripety. It's a not. No, a palintropy. It's a dynamic, organic, living system of powers that determines the outcomes of our actions. But when you're frustrated and things aren't going the way you want, that's too frustrating. And so you just say, you know what? It's either just all good or it's just all bad. So they say either you're completely helpless and nothing's your fault and the forces of history. Somebody somewhere should be punished and then my life would be better. You hear a lot of people talk like that. And then on the other hand, you hear the society is not responsible for any of your problems. They're all your faults. If you're a slave, you must have done it to yourself. If you're poor, you must have done it to yourself. These are the people who like to run around punishing people, on the assumption that if bad things happen, you probably did something wrong that deserves being punished for. All of these things are sort of cartoon versions of the ancient perspective. But they're also the versions that the ancient perspective decayed into as it aged and as it moved into late antiquity, as people lost faith in the capacity of people to influence their outcomes. They became fatalistic. Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about luck. I mean, I'll first start out with what I said before, the fortune cookie that says disregard all previous fortune cookies. So that's important to understand that part. So all the fortune tellers that try to make that into a system is not good for you. But certainly, I kind of believe in luck. But I think the problem you're saying is that don't build that into a system that repeats itself. Like, oh yes, if we could just plot this dot plot, we would just get some more luck. We want more, uh, luck in the lottery or whatever it is. But I kind of believe there's a positive to luck, which is sort of say, it's serendipitous. It just happened. It's like it's not going to repeat itself, but I appreciate it. I don't want to necessarily thank God, but thank heavens for a lucky break. I mean, I think if you see it at serendipitous, you don't have to reject it. It's like you got a lucky break, but you just don't want to build it into a system that you can rely on, because that's a moment that you're going to lose it in the roulette wheel. So I think that's a good way to estimate, because you don't want to also throw away good luck. You might want to throw away bad luck if it was the case, but certainly good luck. I think it shows itself, and just put it away, pocket it or whatever, and just go on doing whatever you do.
Yes. Yes.
That's a way to deal with it.
That's what the Spartans basically tell the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War. It's like, you don't disregard the good luck, but you take it gratefully but humbly. And you don't say, I must be amazing for this good thing I must have done it all myself. That's when you get in trouble.
Yeah, I deserve it. I deserve it.
I'm just that good. That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I didn't make that point very clearly. Yeah, they're not saying throw away the good luck, but treat it like serendipity. Okay, this time we were lucky. Let's be very careful here about how we proceed. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, thanks, Rick, for the interesting discussion. This kind of human errors that you're talking about, giving Oedipus as an example, would be something to do with having to do with the kind of ego consciousness that human beings are subject to, and that kind of ego consciousness without any awareness of one's larger surroundings, which is what exactly leads to doom, right? And so it is Oedipus, the play, something like what Nietzsche talked about in The Birth of Tragedy, that the hero is under this illusion that he is right, and he's on this mission, but he realizes, he doesn't realize early enough that that's what leads to his tragedy, right? But that kind of tragedy is what teaches us that there's a larger context to life.
Yes.
And this kind of representation of the kind of ego that pervades cultures and so forth, is what also leads to the colonialism that thinks that it is above the life realities, is what leads to tragedy, right?
Right. Right. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to miss the mark.
Right.
But what they share in common is we get over invested in our own ego and plans and worldview, and under invested in trying to figure out what's really going on and what really matters. Looking outside of ourselves, outside of our ideologies and experiences, and saying, well, it's that Zen kata fusin. What does nature have to teach us about how to live? As long as we stay kind of always with that in one hand, always trying to look for evidence that we might be wrong, we stand a better chance than the moment in which we start to believe our own bullshit and turn away from the evidence to the contrary of what we think.
Are you saying that the Greek myths were, images that they symbolize warnings about what life is, and that Oedipus maybe it was ignoring those kind of symbolic warnings from the god?
Yeah. When you know the story, Oedipus Tyrannus is a play that's meant to be read a second time. The first time through, you're just like, all this stuff is happening. A second time through, now that you know what's really going on, you notice that there's clues everywhere, like from beginning to end, about how it's going to end. Phil's pointed out some examples of this in the past, and right down to the fact that Tiresias, the blind man, is the one who can see most clearly. Oedipus still has his eyes. He doesn't realize that, it means something that he has eyes but can't see what Tiresias can see. he should be taking that in as a clue. But I mean, everywhere there's like littered clues, and it's Oedipus's perspective and worldview that doesn't let him notice those things. His unconscious keeps dismissing them and pushing them into the background, as those can't be the important part. The important part must be there must be some enemy or some great heroic, thing to be done, or he's trying to construct a typical hero's tale with himself at the center of it, and that's why he misses all the clues to the contrary. So
Right.
yeah, what you're saying is right on, and
Right.
and the Greeks are using that as a classic example of the entire problem of the mortal worldview, which is how easily we select the wrong things to attend to and the wrong things to ignore. If Heraclitus basically says flat out, it's right in front of us. What's really going on is right in front of us every single moment of our lives, and we still don't see it. He compares us to sleepwalkers. It's like when present we're absent. He says, it's just weird what a capacity we have to be responding to the dream life of our ideologies and parochial interpretations rather than the meal of truth that's being served up right for us by nature. Uh, and these are the kinds of problems that if you're aware of them, you can do something about them. If you appreciate that this is the human condition, then you can be on guard, philoctos. You can start to take steps to make things better. The problem only really happens in its worst manifestations when you're off your guard and you think, well, that can't be happening. I'm a modern. I'm the most objective person who ever lived. Moderns see the world the way it really is. All those primitive, superstitious people in the past, I mean, sure, they were confused, but I mean, we're well educated and scientific, so nothing to worry about. We pretty much see the truth. And it's Kenneth is constantly bringing us back to the issue of the con game, the con man, and the people that he tricks. He says this is, in a con game, if you know that the guy is a con artist, half the time the con doesn't work at all. The way that it works is by you lowering your guard. The moment you feel confident, that's why it's called confidence, man. The moment you feel confident is when you are at your most vulnerable, because now you can be led by the nose, by your beliefs and expectations. And he says that's the mortal condition. The mortal condition is we are in a game in which we're going to be conned, and we can either be on our guard against it and do something about it, or we can walk blithely in, sure of ourselves, and then be the perfect victims. And so, you see how different that is from the modern perspective, which is we're born with access to the truth, just like that.
Yeah, the Greeks didn't have the theories about the unconscious that we do today, but they did in a sort of way they did have, right? They had the oracles, they had the gods.
Right.
And these are like representatives of the unconscious, would you say?
Yeah, exactly. It's when Cornford is talking about entheos, that state in which a mortal is possessed by a daimon or a god. He explicitly says the Greeks believed that of the many states that are examples of that, one of the classic ones is the Pythoness at Delphi. They believe that it's not that she's clever and sees the future, it's that she opens herself up to possession so that she can be possessed by Apollo or whatever the spirit of the oracle is, and that the god speaks through her. Heraclitus talks about this too. She says it's not about her. She raves. She says unlovely things. She moves in awkward, uncomfortable, person drunk out of their mind, stoned out of their mind, on drugs out of their mind ways. But the god speaks through her because she's possessed, and the god's smarter than we are, so it can say things that we couldn't, that we would be unable to say because we wouldn't notice those things. So, yeah, I mean, all this stuff is trying to deal with that there's a gap between the finite, which is our conscious mind and our life and our creative works on the one hand, as mortals, this is our status, versus the infinite, which is the world we live in and the responsibilities we have to try to make things work. Those require an organism at a state of development far beyond where we are. And the only way that we can succeed within that kind of a context with such an unfair contest is to be totally on our guard and working together to do the very best we can. Every single time we turn away from that responsibility, every time we decide to just let our ego be in charge or our appetites be in charge, we're setting ourselves up for a disaster, because we only do well when we're putting everything we've got into trying to deal with this significant scope of challenge that we face. So a society that, instead of doing that, says, I'll let other people do that. What I'm going to do is prey on people. I'm gonna try to rob their life savings by creating I'm gonna raid all the SNLs across the entire world. People who think like that are basically setting up everybody for failure, because they're stacking the deck of humanity against itself by investing huge amounts of energy in undoing the things that need to be done for us to survive. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind. Thanks, James, by the way.
Yeah, I think of this actually in general, that it's really about the target, which is obviously about the character aspect of things. So that if you start pursuing things that, and this is the whole idea of doing what's under your control, right? If you're maintaining your character, and because that is something in your interactions with everybody else, then that tragic conversion really can't happen, right? So if that's what your focus is, but if that's not your focus, then you're going to be problematic. Because even if you were to miss, the idea that you have a framework and you have a set of principles that you're kind of relying on, that is actually, keeping you in check and keeping you humble. And it's also understanding the limitations. And the other aspect of it is, like, if you even think about it in terms of how this actually relates to our overconfidence in certain circumstances, like even how it manifests itself today in overconfidence bias. The idea that there's something where a high percentage of people, or I think like almost a very high percentage of people, I forget the exact, believe they're better than average drivers. And then there are individuals that have been in accidents that actually believe they're still better than most like average drivers. And so it's like this distorted perspective of like this distortion of one's own abilities that actually, kind of leads you to this false sense of, of reality, and not understanding even our limitations, or our perspectives on reality are limited. And that's like fundamentally that what we're going against. So all of that kind of leads to that tragic inversion. Like one aspect of it is that you realize that you don't know, you have a set of principles that you're going to rely on, and you're aiming at the right thing, and thus you're focused on what you can control. The other aspect of it is that you really do believe these things about the world, and in a sense that you're successful in one circumstance, and then it ends up to be a tragedy in the next. And so because you have this overconfidence that's being derived from whatever it may be, like, and that's where the circumstances kind of come in too, right? This contingency aspect of things. People think that they're successful, that they'll be successful in every circumstance. Well, no, not necessarily. Like, you have to understand that it may be the circumstances the reason you were successful in the first place, but most people probably don't want to admit that. So it's like kind of multifaceted in a way. It's a very interesting thing, because you can start to see the basis of what in cognitive science is where the biases come in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, these are excellent points. And part of the way that this manifests, the ancient Greeks believed that one of the differences between us and a cheetah, say, is that there's more or less one cheetah way of life that works, that it's evolved to do. I mean, you could tell just by looking at it. There's so many aspects of its anatomy and physiology are designed to run fast and to be a visual, visually focused, really obsessed visually with the things that fascinate it and a desire to unite with them. You combine these things together and you get an animal that, has to creep up in camouflage until it can't creep any further and then run as fast as it possibly can. And that way of life works for the cheetah. The Greeks believed that that's not true for Homo sapiens. It's not only do we not have phronesis, there's no Homo sapiens phronesis the way that there is a cheetah phronesis or a peregrine falcon phronesis or even a apple tree phronesis, right? I mean, all of these other organisms have some coherent strategy, but Homo sapiens is a generalist, and yet not a generalist in the modern sense. Not just, well, I don't have to know anything. I just have to be flexible and adapt and learn as I go, and everything will work out. They didn't believe that. That's a modern conceit, really, and it's along the lines that you're talking about. It's like, moderns believe that we're just lucky, right? We're so flexible that we will just luck out in every situation. You can read in Grimm's fairy tales all these stories about Lucky Hans, or Jack, who just goes out not knowing anything and just, he defeats the giant and he beats the ogre and he does all those things not because he's particularly good at anything, but because he's dumb and lucky, right? Is his thing. And moderns believe we're that guy, except we prefer to call it smart and lucky. And the luck is with us. So we're like that guy who goes in and gambles over and over until he loses his life savings because he believes that 2K won't turn on him. He thinks luck is a personal possession, like a talisman. And that's how we feel about flexibility and adaptability. We think we just possess it and it will solve all our problems for it. But the Greeks didn't believe that. The Greeks thought that there are multiple successful ways of life for Homo sapiens, not just one. But there's also not an infinite number of successful ways of life for Homo sapiens. Most ways of living would fail, they believed. We have this burden on us that we lack that phronesis that would guide us towards the correct behavior. We try to substitute it with culture and flexibility and creativity, but the purpose of that isn't to become infinitely flexible, but to settle down into one of the successful possible life paths for Homo sapiens. And what goes with that hand in hand is the idea that any one of these, like to become a master carpenter, that's your whole life. It takes your whole life. You're never going to be both the greatest master carpenter and the greatest fisherman and the greatest herder of reindeer and the greatest anesthesiologist and all of the other things at the same time. You're just not going to. And the easiest reason why is that every one of these things is essentially infinitely complex. It takes all the creativity you've got and all the life experience you can give it to rise to the top of that profession and make it great. And anything less than that you give to it makes you that much less adequate to meeting the challenges that it faces. You won't be as good as the guy who spent his whole life doing it if you only spent half your life doing it, assuming you're both smart and creative and dedicated and well acculturated to that lifestyle. So you can see then if you split yourself among four things, you're only going to be a quarter as good, maybe at most. And if you try to split yourself between an infinite number of things to be infinitely flexible, you aren't going to be good at anything. It's that generalist problem. And sometimes we joke about generalism as a problem. Sometimes we don't really mean the joke. We really mean, yeah, we think that being infinitely flexible is, we truly believe in clever Hans and clever Jack, and we think that we're the ones who are going to be good at everything, and we'll just figure it out as we go along. But the Greeks believed that was just deep foolishness. So core to the ancient belief system is this recognition that if there are multiple ways for Homo sapiens to succeed, and if success actually isn't pick one off the menu and you're good, but if it's that somebody needs to be a master carpenter and somebody needs to be a master plumber and somebody better be good at herding reindeer and somebody, you need all of these skills for Homo sapiens to thrive. We've got to make up for all the stuff we don't have. We don't have the great claws and the big teeth and the spine that can bend like a cheetah's spine. All these gifts that they have, we don't have any of that stuff. So what we need is is a bunch of different people doing different things, but not an infinite number of things. They need to do the right things. Each of them has its right direction to aim in that works as long as somebody else is also aiming in the other direction that leads to another right thing that also has to be part of society. You see the difference between this and the idea of flexibility, right? This is in many ways the antithesis of the infinitely flexible worldview of a modern, that, you know, if we just are good at everything or anything, then everything will work out. It's like, absolutely not. Most things we shouldn't be doing at all, right? None of us should be exploring what happens if we, you know, if we eat the green parts of a tomato plant, you know, or the green parts of a potato plant, or the green parts of the rhubarb plant. And there's all this stuff in the world that'll kill you dead. And we shouldn't be doing any of those things. And there's no such thing as, I'm going to be really good. I'm going to be the world's best green tomato, you know, tomato green eater. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to be dead is what you're going to be. And there are essentially an infinite number of ways to go wrong. It doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It means that as a whole, your culture needs to be cultivating. Yeah, Abhi, we'll have you ask in just a second. I'm going to have you jump the line because you're new to the call, and everybody else has got their hands up. We've all been here for years, so we'd love to hear from someone new. So in just a second, I'll call on your question. But the idea is that there are a certain number of ways to go right. We don't know how many there are, right? The Greeks didn't pretend that they knew them all, but there's a certain number of ways to go right, and those paths are legitimate targets for a society to aim at, so long as it aims at enough of them that they can work together to create a whole workable organism of human society or human species. That's what you're after. That's where phronesis needs to take you. Phronesis needs to take you into, if you're just thinking at an individual level, it needs to take you into one of those paths that works. Maybe you make the path more interesting and better and develop it. It's not just about doing what people before you did, but it is about developing that path and walking it. And then if you're thinking at the level of a polis or a species, it's about trying to find all the paths and making sure that somebody is walking those paths and that they have what they need, and that you're not organizing your society in such a way that it destroys one of those paths and makes it non-viable. Because, you know, if the people who bring us clean water can't make a living, then we're all going to die because we all need clean water, right? There's things, it's like, if you want to learn about surgery by practicing on yourself, you probably shouldn't go too deep, and you certainly shouldn't be carving up your own heart. This is that thing about, there's an infinite number of things we could be doing, and most of them will kill us. We should be protecting the things that we need for survival. And doing that requires knowing what's required for survival. And knowing what's required for survival, and this is the core of the ancient critique of Homo sapiens, is an enormous problem for us as a species. And we're the only species that has that problem. Trees don't go around accidentally cutting themselves down. They might fall down because they're pushed down by fortune or 2K, but they don't like develop a forge and forge a saw and then saw off their own trunk. They don't do that, but people do that sort of thing all the time. And the number of people who kill themselves in accidents with tools or handguns or what have you every year, it's insane. Right? This is a problem that we distinctively have, and the ancients tried to organize their entire civilization and culture to address that problem because they saw it as the most important existential problem facing our species. We, on the other hand, don't see it as any problem at all. Right? I mean, we might as individuals, but as a society, we don't. There's no law that says don't create a perverse incentive to destroy humanity. That's not on the list of laws anywhere. Just like, you know, President of the United States, nowhere on it is don't elect somebody who desperately wants to push the button. You know, it's like, you know, with all the things to leave out of the requirements for president, you probably shouldn't elect somebody who wants to destroy everything. But according to law, that's fine, no problem. If you got the votes, he's in. Anyway, Joe, you wanted to add something, and then I'll call on.
Oh no, I mean, I just wanted to say thank you, because like what you really did link it there to is the idea of how the health of the polis, like the health of the whole, kind of factors into that in a way, so
Yes.
that you start to see that you don't exist in a vacuum.
Yes.
Once you don't understand you don't exist in a vacuum, you also recognize the circumstances that you're in, and what role that plays in your success.
Yes.
Right? Because the
Yes.
circumstances are like essentially you have to change the circumstances, like, or, or make it better in some way. You start to see a role in, however, whatever the circumstances may be, you're looking to improve them. And then that starts to define a relationship with everybody else, as opposed to just having a relationship with yourself.
That's right.
So like all of that is actually, the way you linked that was pretty interesting, is the idea of an organism and how an organism could die otherwise. It's like,
Yeah.
or turned in on itself.
Yeah, that's right.
I appreciate that.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, this is really core to the ancient worldview. It's core to the definition of, kind of, for those who've joined us who weren't here at the beginning, we're talking about sophrosune, which is the core word in that first paragraph from Kenneth Smith's section H, sophism and corruption. Because he's talking about the fall of the ancient worldview and how it collapsed, and that the collapse was all about who has sophrosune, who doesn't have sophrosune, who's governing, who's not governing. Do you have people governing or pretending to govern who lack sophrosune, and what are the consequences of doing that? This is what all he's going to talk about. And so we're taking a month or two here to talk about sophrosune. So Abby, come off mute and tell us your question.
Hi, it's actually Abby, just so everyone knows.
Hi, Abby.
Hi, my question, I read some of the text. I understand it's sort of like you said, the sophrosune thing that you're focusing on now, but the sort of comparison between the ancient Greek way of life and to the modern life now that we're living. And from what you were saying, to me, like, I feel like there's a missing element of like the spirituality that was inherent in the like Greek way of life. I mean, you talked about the gods, and the gods had to do with nature, but there was personified deities that, ruled over the logic of the land. And I feel like a lot of that has been, like, as you guys are already talking about, that sort of like understanding of like a greater natural ruler of order is sort of absent from any like immediate relationship psychologically or like ontologically from our modern way of life. Especially like in America, the last thing that you can think of as having a like strong spiritual influence is Christianity, obviously, which in a lot of ways like resembles, the history of the ancient Greek history of spirituality. There are some resemblances between that and Christianity in some ways, especially in the Old Testament. But my question is just like, in what ways do we all think that, the absence of this like inherent, embodied understanding as individuals and society of this, like, of the God, basically the God figure or gods, how that is just so separate, like intimately from our lives now, and that how that contributes to like that modern person that you speak of, or that the text referenced?
That's a great question, Abby. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I mean, part of what's happening is in this book, Millennia and Microcosm, Kenneth Smith is talking about the concept of a worldview and saying that in different epochs of European history, there have been 3 documented epochs, each of which had a worldview that is in some ways the opposite of the other 2. Each of the 3 is opposed to the one that came before it, and the one that follows it is opposed to it. And so there's this way in which they're antagonistic. And yet, in each case, the people who lived during a given epoch imagined that they were seeing the world the way it really was. People generally thought that they're seeing an accurate picture of the world. The idea that when we're looking at the world, we're actually projecting blind spots all over it. And through that projection of blind spots, we're limiting the number of things that stand out as important to us that we're going to focus on. This is almost inconceivable to most people. Then, we don't like to imagine that we're blind to the things that matter. We'd like to think that we know how it really is. So, what we're doing in chapter 4, which is the chapter that we're in right now of this book, is we're looking at the ancient worldview. And when we finish, which is not that many more months from now. It's soon. We're going to move into a series of chapters that are all about the medieval worldview, talking about the medieval version of Christianity and how it conceived of the world and so forth. And then ultimately, for the final chapters, we'll come back to the modern worldview, our own, but now we'll be assessing it from the perspective of being able for the first time to mentally move ourselves out of that modern worldview and look at it as an ancient might look at it, or look at it as a medieval might look at it and say, well, what would they think about this, about the modern perspective? In other words, we're trying to learn to voluntarily alienate ourselves from our modern worldview in order to turn around and look at it and see what it truly is, which we can't do as long as we're the fishy swimming within the water. But what you talked about puts your finger right on what Nietzsche and a lot of existentialists, including Kenneth Smith, consider one of the most important defining features of the modern worldview, which is the modern worldview was, the modern epoch was created in direct opposition to the medieval, right, worldview. It was in the 1400s, 1500s, many people felt that the institutions of medievalism that were supposed to be the most sacred and holy had instead become the very most corrupted, that they were the worst. You had popes with harems and children and giving their massive amounts of money to their children and making them popes in turn, and interfering in everything that they swore back in 500 that they would never do, that they said were the worst vices of ancient Rome, they were now doing by 1500. And it caused a massive collapse of faith that led to the rejection of the medieval framework for a way of life. And core to that is the idea that if there's a sacred, if there's a God, you can't trust human institutions to tell you what that is. So we gave them 1,000 years to tell us what it is. And instead they came up with, well, God says you should put money in my pocket. God says my son should be the Pope. I mean, it was just massive amounts of corruption. So they're like, religion should be a private concern. It's between you and the sacred. And all of society will instead be structured around explicit laws and an economy that deals explicitly through money. Everything will be counted and accounted for and done logically and through parliaments and decision making. And God will have no place in that other than the ways in which our religious experience informs our vote or our actions in the world. And so in doing this, we thought that the people who did this thought that they were rescuing religion from being corrupted by human institutions. But as you've observed, and Nietzsche observes, and many existentialists observe, the actual effect was to entirely remove questions of what's sacred from official decision making by the economy or government. I.e., we replaced maybe highly corrupted for sure, but a value-centric way of making decisions got replaced with a numerical way of making decisions. Do you have the most votes? Do you have the most money? Can you get enough countries to vote for a treaty? Now, all of this stuff turned into just crunching numbers and doing calculations. And what was missing from all of that is any sense that anything mattered other than the vote or the purchase price. And as Nietzsche points out, that effectively kills God. In our minds, we stop being capable of having a religious experience in the way that a medieval could have had it, in the way Joan of Arc would have had it, or in the way an ancient would have had it. It alienates us from the sources of meaning, and it turns every human political or economic decision into a mere tug of war to see who has the most votes or who has the most money. And of course, the consequences are catastrophic levels of nihilism that we experience every day in our institutions. So it's a great question, and it goes right to the heart of why Kenneth Smith wrote this book. We'll be, basically, it's such a deep question you've asked. We'll be answering it for the entire rest of the time we run these seminars, however many years that is. It's the core question about modernity. So
yeah, thank you. Very well said.
Thank you for that, Abby.
Yeah, of course. And I'm excited. Well, I didn't realize that you guys were reading this whole entire book. So forgive me for interjecting on the Greek portion of it. But yes, please carry on.
You were right on the money. Your question was right on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, the downfall of Oedipus was the irony, of course, that even though he had two open eyes, he was still no better than a blind man to what he didn't see. And Tiresias had the advantage of being sight impaired, so he knew he had a problem. But Oedipus said, hey, I've got the perfect instrument. I've got all the perfect, I've got the best sword, I've got the best shield, but he forgot the talent that's required to use them properly. And in the end, of course, he destroys the eyes that failed him when it was he who failed his eyes. But another thing I was going to say about this thing about Tiki, that people look back to the tremendous post-war growth in the economy. And a lot of it was the growth of oil production that was huge. The oil production, world oil production, was doubling every 5 years and every 10 years. And then by the 1970s, that growth had slowed down. Now, Keynes thought he was a genius, and here's my economic system: spin, spin, spin. And it worked when the windfall was there. And everyone thought, you're a genius, Keynes, standing there, you told us what to do, and it was only working because of that windfall. And governments overspent, but the economic growth forgave their sins of overspending in 2 or 3 years. But then it slowed down in the 70s, and we had a classic era of inflation. And then Milton Friedman came along and said, oh, well, Keynes was wrong. Here's my system. And his system was working better with the more limited growth that showed up. But I was on, economic boards and property boards about 20 years ago, and people discussing all those matters. And I actually bothered to do this sort of research into what had happened in these periods. And, since the baby boomers had the windfall, big, dumb and stupid, but they had the windfall, all the fruit just fell on the ground. And generation X, Y, Z since then have looked at the baby boomers and said, where's ours? Where's our windfall? You're holding out on us. Where have you hidden it all? You've cheated us. And no, they were just living at a time when this windfall came down, and now you're living at a time when there isn't a windfall. But they think it's deliberate. Somebody's not working the right switches. That's all. So that's what Keynes was telling people. Oh, you just have to pull the switches the right way and we're in heaven. But it was forces external to choices in a sense that were being made. But today they still won't accept it. And they still believe that it is some magic incantation will create the glories of the post-war economy yet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, these issues of seeing versus being blind, they're all over Oedipus Tyrannus, but of course the reason they're all over that is because Sophocles is trying to talk about us and say, these are our issues. What good is it to have the eyes if you look at the situation and then your brain just suppresses all the important parts because you think they're not important? And then the things you've suppressed turn out to be the important parts. This is what the cheetah can't do. The cheetah can't look at the gazelle and suppress it into the background as unimportant. Its instincts won't let it do that. This is one of the ingredients of its phronesis. Of the infinite number of things that get suppressed, it develops in such a way that it can't help but notice the things that it has to notice in order to survive. Whereas we easily fail to notice the things that we need to do in order to survive. It comes naturally to us to, to select what to attend to, not on the basis of what's healthy for us or good for our survival, but instead on the basis of, on the one hand, our parochial experiences and appetites, which are too limited. And on the other hand, our ideologies, which are too abstracted. This is Hegel's critique of the two basal modes of the mind. And either one of those basically causes hamartia. To use the framework that we're talking about here, this Aeschylean framework that Cornford's, finding in Thucydides, he's saying, the issue is that missing the mark is for a cheetah, missing the mark in terms of attention is very hard to do. But for Homo sapiens, not missing the mark is very hard to do. There are 1,000 ways to go wrong. And this is the nasty little surprise that evolution has given us, along with our intelligence and creativity, that the intelligence and creativity come precisely because of our detachment from the things that matter, so that we can, we could focus on art, and yeah, maybe we died, but we left an amazing cave painting that people are going to be just drooling over for, for the next 45,000 years. We can have a creative impact on a scale that people couldn't do before, but it comes at the cost of, not always paying attention to the things that matter. It's risky. And what you're describing, regardless of whether it's exactly accurate or approximately accurate, I'm not going to worry about that, but Keynes versus Friedman versus, do we see what's happening with our economy? Do we not see what's happening? Do we understand what we should be doing or what we should not be doing? These issues of the blindness versus awareness are things that the literature and culture of the Greeks prepared them to notice. If you told the ancient Greeks, more or less, what you just told us, the ancient Greeks would be perfectly ready to accept the idea that billions of people could look right at the economy and miss it, right? That makes sense to them, that human beings would make a mistake like that. But to moderns who believe we've got a birthright of objectivity, that we're supposedly supposed to see things the way they really are, merely because we're moderns, which makes us scientific and objective, it's almost inconceivable that 8 billion people could look at the economy and not one of them could get it right. We just don't, we find that implausible, and that is the phronesis failing to take effect. We don't understand ourselves well enough to know our liability to miss what's right in front of our noses, the way that the ancients did. They were totally ready here, that they were missing what was right in front of their noses. I mean, for those who weren't in the previous calls, the example that we cite repeatedly is the way that the ancient Greeks and even the ancient Romans were not genocidal about religion the way we are. It wouldn't have even occurred to them. Medievals were all about the idea that every other religion has to be exterminated. Only
they
the
didn't have
religion is right.
monotheism.
Sorry.
I don't mean to interrupt, but they didn't have any monotheism, right?
Right.
In Greek, so that's probably part of it too.
Yeah, exactly. The structure of their polytheism was such that they didn't believe, not only didn't they think they had the right one God, they didn't even think they had the right 12 gods. They thought that the issue of the sacred is an infinite area, and that mortal attempts to understand the sacred will always fall short of what the sacred actually is. So as a result,
add that Plato did preach a type of monotheism.
He did, but he was philosophizing, so it's a little different from what their core culture was doing. He was a weirdo. But the general idea was anytime they'd meet a new culture and they'd find out that that culture had different gods than they had, the very first thing the Greeks wanted to know about is that those other gods. They're not like, you all must absolutely stop what you're doing this instant and start worshiping our gods. That's what a medieval would have done. But what they did is, oh my God, what have we missed? show us your pantheon, and we're frantically going to go through it looking for the gaps in our religion, and then we're going to try to fill those gaps with the gods that you noticed and that we missed somehow, because the Greeks were going to think that, well, this explains a great deal of our catastrophes in our history. You knew about that God, so you didn't make those mistakes. We didn't know about that God, so we did make those mistakes. If only we'd known what you know. So they were like desperately trying to collect deities. You really see this in the Hellenistic period with the Library of Alexandria constantly doing, they basically invented comparative religion. Well, that one sort of sounds like Zeus. That sort of sounds like Aphrodite, but I don't think we have one of those. So quick, let's add it. We need to grow the pantheon. So this is an example of just like the opposite of what the medievals would do around these sorts of things. So it's exactly the last thing in the world they would have wanted to do is to stamp out evidence of other gods. They wanted to hear about the other gods. It was very important to them to catch up. They felt they were always playing catch up, trying to learn more about the sacred. And the idea that any human culture could run around the world telling all the others they're wrong and trying to stamp out their religions was pretty much inconceivable. Even the Romans, who were trying to go all over the world and conquer everything, the first thing they do when they conquer a new province is they'd ask them about their gods and set up temples to those gods. I mean, all over Britain and Europe, there are temples to Celtic gods, there are temples to Germanic gods built by the Romans, because the Romans didn't want to get in trouble with the gods. And they had the same general idea the Greeks did. You know, there's a lot more to the gods than people know. If you found a god we don't know about, we do not want to offend that god. We would like to get on the right side of that god. So they're running around building temples to gods that they didn't even have. You know, because they're like, you know, the sacred is not something that people rule. We don't get to dictate terms to the sacred. We don't get to write a book that says this is what is sacred and this is what is not, and now everybody has to obey. That was inconceivable to the ancients. It's not part of the ancient worldview. It's very medieval, though. And when moderns imagine religion, or when we go about our substitutes for religion, we do them in the same genocidal medieval ways. The whole world has to be in the same economy. The whole world has to have the same politics. The whole world has to follow the same laws. We want to do what the medievals did. We want one right answer, and we want to eliminate all the other answers. And so in this way, even though a medieval would never consider us to be medieval, because I mean, where the hell is God in all of this? Ancients wouldn't have considered either of us to be ancient. They'd look at us both going, man, you guys are sure of yourselves.
There's a dangerous aspect to the medieval all-powerful God, though.
Yes.
Such a concept rules out chaos.
Yes.
The Greeks
Well, it creates
believed
the
there
problem
was
of evil,
chaos.
right? Yes.
Watch out. No matter
Yes.
how smart you are, the chaos will get you. Whereas the medieval Christian would think, well, God's not going to throw me any problems which are beyond my powers. And
right.
Well, if I do die, I'm going to go to heaven anyway. There's no, things will work out in the end. Sounds rather Hegelian, isn't it?
Yes.
All's well that ends well.
Yes.
That son of the devil, Hegel, was preaching that in the end.
Yes. Yes. It's you know, each of these worldviews, and this is part of Hegel halfway gets here, the later existentialists get here more. Each of these worldviews contains its contradictions that it can't explain from within the perspective of its worldview. And the medieval effort to eliminate corruption, chaos, by putting everything in the hands of a single all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, ubiquitous God is in philosophical circles, it's called the problem of evil, which is if he's all good, why is there evil in the world? I mean, if he was all good and helpless, maybe there's a devil doing evil and God for some reason can't fix that. Okay, that's an explanation. But you said God's all powerful and all knowing and all good. So there can't be a devil doing bad things unless God wants there to be a devil doing bad things. You know, why are children born in Africa, you know, who get this parasitical worm infection that makes them blind before they even get a chance to live their life? How is this God's plan? And the medieval answer is shut up. I mean, really, you know, it basically came down to don't ask those questions. God's mysterious. He works in mysterious ways, and it's not for us to know, which is a way of saying we don't know the answer, but we want to keep telling you that we do know the answer. And if you tell us that we don't know the answer, then we're going to burn you at the stake. So because we're busy trying to stamp out all the heresies because all the heresies are evil and we're all good. So there's a contradiction built right at the heart of the medieval worldview, which is it can't explain the actual world as we perceive it. This is similar to the medievals, as we'll see when we get into the medieval section. They had a critique of the ancient world, what the ancients didn't see, that they didn't understand, that they couldn't see a contradiction at the heart of their belief system. And the same is true for us. we have contradictions at the heart of our belief system, some of which are along the lines that Abby pointed out. It's like if nothing is sacred, then how are we supposed to make decisions? What happens to a society that holds nothing sacred? What if it's only about the law, then what happens when 7 lions and a zebra vote on what to have for lunch? I mean, there are problems in a society that everything is decided by laws and money, and nothing is decided by anything mattering. And we're living sort of through that. So, but we're going to come back to phronesis here in a little bit. So first, Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll go back to phronesis.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a dual problem. It first started with the figure-ground relationship and the framing. Now, I teach art, and so I understand the figure-ground relationship. And it's very, very difficult to teach art students the relationship with that ground, because I think it begins with a fundamental problem of human beings to begin with. In other words, since 90% of our relationship with the world through our senses is through our eyes, and the other 5 senses, including the ears, which is the next most appropriate, is only makes up about 10% of our relationship with the world. So the eyes were very, very important in objectifying things. And the objectification of the world in terms of objects makes it difficult to jump back and forth between the figure and the ground, because the ground is in some ways non-objective, or least less objective. It's in the ground. It's sort of blurry and whatever it is, but it has a very intimate relationship with the framing of the picture. In the case of the framing of the city, the framing of everything in that sense, the relationship with the bigger ground. And that is a very, very fundamental problem. I remember once when I was going for a job at Youngstown State, the dean was a musician. And he said, Phil, what is the difference between art and music? You know, which is sort of like an improper question to ask, because, you know, like I'm a specialist in art, and I think I surprised him by saying, well, the problem is that we depend on our eyes to objectify the world, and it's very difficult to be objectified. And music live in a fortunate medium, because it exists in a kind of floating world, because everything is about harmony, nothing's specific, everything's related to everything else. And I think that's a major difference between the two approaches. And I think it's so therefore it's more about relationships than objectification, although melodies are certainly there, but not as important as harmony. And so the second thing is, I want to go back to the Egyptians. I brought this up a number of times about the relationship of Osiris and Seth, about measurements. And I wonder whether part of the problem with the contemporary world, the modern world, is in the fact that, you know, we have built a second ecology that's so complex, the synthetic ecology versus the natural ecology, that we have to operate in. In fact, most of us spend most of the time within that ecology rather than in nature. So we distance ourselves from nature. And myself included, by the way. I don't want to say, you know, those guys. So in some sense, it's become so complex, particularly in relationship to measurements and instrumentality, that in a sense, and that's why I sort of have some doubts about measurements, is that, yes, it's sort of an objectification of the world in some sense, because the measurements objectify how things have length and width and how small length and so forth, rather than creating harmony as the primary function. And our society, not only in terms of architecture, city planning, government, all of that has been objectified in some sense. It's become so complex that all of us have to be specialists, and not only specialists, but specialists within a specialty. So therefore, none of us understand anything beyond our specialization. And so therefore, in a sense, we are living in a kind of isolated world without understanding the ground, the synthetic ground that we're in, let alone the natural ground, the ecology. And so therefore, in a sense, we build a society in which we have to depend and have trust in others. And others, because when I go to a doctor, I have to trust my doctor. He or she could be a quack, you know. I go to my auto mechanic. He could be, you know, somebody who's trying to take advantage of me. You know, the stores, you know, like your credit card and all that. There's all sorts of things you don't understand about the economic structure, about medicine, about auto mechanics, any of that stuff. So therefore, trust has to be woven into the structure itself. But to the degree that we have loosened up that thing, and, you know, in other words, antitrust is in a way, in a sense, to acknowledge the fact there is something that's destroying trust. You know, and trust in a funny way is related to faith. Faith, you believe in the God will take care of it. Trust, we believe in each other in the social structure. So in a case which we don't know anything except our very, very small bit of understanding in our relationship, in my case, art, and more specifically painting, if you want to go that way, and more specifically painting with acrylics, you know. So in some sense, all of that is based on, in a sense, trying to get other information from other specialists and teaching what other people don't understand what I do in relationship to what it is. So therefore, it's a web of relationship that we have to have. And once the trust breaks down, as we see on January 6th, then in a sense, all hell goes loose, because we can't even trust the medium. We can't trust anybody, what anybody says, whether it's a president or somebody who's running for president or the senators, because we know that they do insider trading. That's one of the reasons why they went into office, you know? And now I see, I guess, because I've been suffering as a mark, because I, in the past, you know, contributed quite a bit, I mean, for my means, to the Democrats. And now I'm contributing most of my money to the Ukraine, because in some sense, at least they're fighting what they believe in, right? Rather than let the government or whatever take care of it. And so I'm getting hundreds, well, not hundreds, but tens and tens of email begging for money, to the point that I don't even have time to read it. So I just essentially cancel it whatsoever. So they've lost not only my trust, but my relationship with the fact that I actually can't even funnel through all the requests, so that I've submitted to them, to everybody just want money. That's what it is. And I've given my money elsewhere. Not that I haven't singled out a few things I still give to the Democrats, but in some sense, it's like they must think that I'm a millionaire or something. You know, it's like I have endless money, just like, you know, help me do this, help me do this. You know, everybody is like, I don't even know these people, just because, and sometimes I don't even, not even for sure they're a Democrat, let alone that they are, because they would post something of somebody that looks kind of like, oh, maybe, but that may be talking about the Republicans, not why you have to like give to us. So in some sense, once you've broken the web of trust,
yes,
in this age of specialization, particularly age of specialization in terms of such instrumental relationship in our relationship to the world, not only instrumental in terms of, let's say, measuring the length of a pool or something, but instrumental in terms of the way the structure of the bureaucracy and everything is done in terms of a bureaucratic instrumentation. And so, yeah, I think that becomes a real problem.
Yeah.
Because we have lost faith in what is absolutely necessary for grounding our belief in the system. And
Right.
so that becomes a problem. So I wonder whether that isn't part of not that actually as an outcome of the weight of civilization being so complex that it bears down on each of us because we don't know anything. We have to trust other people, experts, but they all could be fraudsters, you know. So the weight of civilization itself in a simpler system, we could say, yeah, I think that guy is committing a fraud, you know, he's, but when it's so complex, you actually have to trust them, you know, it's your life or trust us where you go, you know, like, so I think the weight of civilization is bearing down on us.
Yeah. I think you're right on the money. You know, this web of trust, this is, you know, the ancient Greeks would say this is an inevitable requirement of the fact that it takes multiple ways of life working together as a dynamic system for a polis to survive. And that's just a polis. We're trying to do an entire planet. You know, so it's you know, the what you talk about the weight is certainly there, but you know, it magnifies the issues that the Greeks were worried about, which is I can't possibly know enough about one of these other ways of life that I depend on in order to judge whether or not they're doing it right. I can't.
Yeah, I have to be Atlas to live up to the weight of the world.
That's right. You got to carry the heavens on your back, right? And unfortunately, we're not Titans, so we don't have that kind of carrying capacity. So, you know, so this issue is there that I'm lucky if I can understand my own way of life. Well, you know, I'm a medical programmer. Can I understand medical programming well enough to figure out whether another medical programmer can be trusted? That's still an open question. I mean, it turns out even medical programming has to be subdivided into about 100 different disciplines, one for each medical discipline. And so really, I can't even judge most medical programmers. I can judge the people who worked on the parts of medical programming that I've worked on. That's what I'm competent to judge. But, you know, if Sharon walks into the doctor's office and she's going to do my anesthesia, you know, it's got to be trust. That's all I've got to offer here. You know, I can't in any way critique her work.
And the world requires us to specialize. It really requires us to specialize. Yeah. Ever since the education system, everything is like, you know, be a specialist or else you're not going to get a job or whatever to survive in the world. Also, the contributor to society, but in some sense, that begins to dissipate our understanding of the world.
Yeah.
The system.
Yeah. I mean, if you read, you know, Black Elk Speaks, or the you know, the narrative of Black Hawk, or if you read Neither Wolf Nor Dog, you know, one of the things that a lot of indigenous writers will say is that when the colonists came to North America, that the indigenous people just were absolutely not prepared for what liars and con artists they were. They'd never met anybody like that, whose whole life was about getting an advantage over your neighbor. You know, they always imagined that they were being told the truth, that people really needed the things they really said that they needed. And I think about Columbus's diary, you know, when he says, oh my God, these Taino Indians, they're such idiots. They believe everything we say and they give us everything we ask for. They'll make the best slaves. It's like his whole mind is a con artist's mind. Look at these rubes that I can dominate. You can't build a society out of people like Columbus. You can have something else and call it a society. That's what we do. We say a whole bunch of people all out to screw each other. That's a civilization. But the ancient Greeks would have said that's the opposite of a civilization. It's a form of barbarism. And David Rohl sometimes quotes Kenneth Smith in his use of the word barbarism, not to mean people whose language goes bar, 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 but a people that's not concerned at all with phronesis or sophrosune. Their entire concern is how do I get one over on the guy next to me? And you can't make a society like that. You can make something else, but it's a lot more like going to a carnival where everybody's out to pick your pocket. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So as I listen to us identify all the parameters of character and how it impacts us as individuals and how that constructs a society. So I go back to the text, excuse me, and I see that very first sentence, which catches my eye in the second paragraph, when we're talking about Sofosune. And it says, the ultimate stress upon any aristocratic order, which is a society, is the discontent of those excluded. And Phil was just talking about this discontent from his highest privileges. For the principles that explain the system of order are truly esoteric matters. And that, I think, is where, as individuals, it depends on us to chart our own pathways. And that's where the character comes in. That's what you're talking about. Comprehensible in a degree only to those to those aristoi whose business is it to secure the polis foundations. And the polis here, I take it, means a society. So here we go again. The governing class are the people who's going to set the tone. You're just talking about Columbus. He goes, he sees the Indians. He's the governing class, and the Indians have different cultural parameters from Columbus. They don't understand why he wants to buy their land because they don't own it. It belongs to the greater powers. It belongs to they don't own it, so they can't sell it. And that was one of the differences, one of the problems that they had. So I think what we're talking about here is mostly discussed in this next paragraph, which is very, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, this is all setting up the next paragraph. That's what this whole discussion about Sofosune is about, is getting us ready to read this the way that he means it. You know, it's difficult for us, raised within a society whose primary concern is how to liberate the money in our pockets, to understand what the Greeks considered a society to be. One of the most common ways that modernity excuses itself is to say, well, first of all, it denies that it's bad. It denies it has problems, or then it tries to minimize the problems. Then it tries to say that the problems are a virtue. But if you ever back it into a corner and make it admit that there are problems that are not virtues, that are part of modernity, it always has the same answer. Well, nobody else ever did any better. Right? This is as good as it can get. It can never be better than this. We're the top. Maybe the top is way down below where you want it to be. But if you want anything to be better, you're just a utopian, right? It's insane. It's impossible. This is as good as it gets. Preying upon one another, you know, screwing each other over, wrecking everything. That's all you can hope for from Homo sapiens. This is modernity's final argument. Just shut up. Just, you know, or I punch you in the face. You're a bad person. And what's hilarious about it is that there's enormous amounts of evidence that it's not true. But modernity works very hard to push all that into the background. There needs to not be a present society anywhere in the world that is actually focused on taking care of each other. Because if there is, it puts the lie to the argument that things can't be any better than this. And modernity can't afford to have that argument come out. This was the argument, and it was pretty much said straight up this way. Why was Indian Territory turned into Oklahoma? Why did the United States renege on the treaty that established Indian Territory and instead converted into a state? And in all the documents, which anybody can read at the Library of Congress if they can afford the time to go read, you know, what the president and his cabinet were talking about, they basically said the problem is that all the white settlers on the borders of Indian Territory keep comparing what happens in there to what happens out here in our country and going, wow, our country sucks. I want to be an Indian. And they go in and they join, and Indian Territory says, welcome, brother. You know, come here, do your fair share of work and you're fine. And, you know, they're having a brain drain. They were losing people. White people all along the borders of Indian Territory were giving up and, you know, on being modern Americans and were wanting to be Indians. And so they said, well, the only way we can fix this problem is to make sure there isn't an Indian Territory. White people need to not see an example of people behaving better, or else they'll start to get ideas. And we can't have that. So they need to go. They need to go bye-bye. This is not me saying this. This is what they said. And so then they broke their own. That's why they broke their own international treaty, opened the borders, and turned it into a land grab. The Supreme Court, I think it was just in the last year, recently ruled that the United States absolutely broke the law when it converted Indian Territory into Oklahoma, and that almost all of Oklahoma belongs to the tribes. And the people who live in Oklahoma mostly are living there on the sufferance of its real owners, who are the tribes who are disparaged by that violation. So you got to say, what were the stakes? How could the stakes be so high that the U.S. government would risk putting itself in a situation of invalidating itself, under international law? Well, the stakes are the argument that there's anything better than this. Modernity can't afford that argument to be made anywhere. Nothing must ever be allowed to be considered better than this. And anybody who ever says it doesn't have to be like this, people need to dogpile on top of them and shame them as a utopian. The idea that anything could ever improve is utopian. And utopian means socialist, which means evil, which means you're terrorist, which means, you go to Guantanamo. So we will have none of that. It's not going to happen. So this is a very different approach from the ancient Greek approach. In the ancient world, the polises within the Greek world were all different from each other. That's why Aristotle wrote his book on government, on the politics. He says you can look around and see an enormous variety of different ways of organizing society. Every different polis has its own ideas about what's the right way to govern, what's the right way to organize its religion and its societies. And we should study those things, and they're interesting. We should learn about our variety of choices. Modernity says there is no choice. You're absolutely free to choose, the Model T in black. You can have this, and you're absolutely free to choose this, but don't you dare try to choose anything else. We might have to bring you some freedom, as the internet meme goes. So let's go back to these ideas. Phronesis, right? There's a difference between knowing what you have to do to not get in trouble, which is what moderns learn, versus knowing what's actually healthy for our species, which is what Aristotle says human beings need to have but don't have. We're only going to have that if we grow up in a healthy culture that cultivates us to learn artificially and with great difficulty, which ways of life actually might work. That's what phronesis is about. It's the ability to think on those terms and to not let perverse incentives constantly be pulling your aim off the mark, hamartia, into tragedy. And Aristotle doesn't pretend that everybody can do it. This is what Kenneth Smith's talking about in the lines that Sharon was quoting, right? For most people, it's an insurmountable problem to get over their own parochial experiences and appetites on the one hand, and their own ideologies and logics on the other, to be able to see what's actually happening and what actually matters. It's very hard. So you certainly don't want your society governed by the people who aren't even trying, who don't think it's a problem to impose their ideology on everybody else or their logic, the way Stalin did, or the Nazis, right? You don't want people who are just going to impose their appetites on everybody else. You exist in order to serve me. Your bank account exists in order to rate it to put into my bank account. These people can't be in charge. They can call themselves a government, but what they're doing wouldn't be recognized by the ancients as governance. They're examples of what Aristotle called the worst of all possible governments, which is a kind of anti-government. You put your trust in it because you have to put your trust in a complex society, into institutions, and then it uses that as a confidence man uses it to betray you. So you're living in a state of tragic inversion under those conditions, aren't you? This is why I keep talking about tragedy when we're trying to talk about Sofer Sune. When you spend your whole life living within a society that sees you as a utensil at best and a drain of resources at worst, then you can't develop phronesis because you have no examples around you of what it would look like if people were actually focused on doing the right thing, the healthy thing, the good thing, and not just the ideological thing or the appetitive thing or what the law demands. We're living in a state when you're in that state, you can't. We are all blind, right? There are things that we can't see. Now, the reason we're in a philosophy seminar is because we're suspecting that not everything is kosher. There's something rotten somewhere in Denmark. Right? We have questions that we want to ask, that we're not trusting, our newspapers and TV shows and political pundits to give us the accurate answers to. And we're trying to look more deeply at what the hell might be going on. This is why Hegel says the owl of Minerva takes flight with the fall of night. When things start to be a mess is when people start to question their current epoch and the way that it works and say, well, I can't fully believe anymore that everything that I was told was true, because if everything I was told was true, half of the things that I hate in the world wouldn't be happening. Maybe there'd be other things, but the promises that an epoch makes, by the time you get to the late stage of an epoch, it becomes more and more abundantly obvious that it's breaking those promises. So in ancient Rome, the cream isn't rising to the top, the turds are. Right? It's become corrupt. It's become openly, obviously rotten. Get people like Caligula in charge, or Commodus. And nobody believes that Caligula or Commodus has the best personal character. They're not examples of Aristoi. So Augustine writes City of God, saying, okay, the city of man is absolutely corrupted, as we can see. It's betraying every promise it has. Anybody can see it. It's become open and obvious. It's the same in the 1500s with the Borgia popes, right? And all of the other forms of intense corruption of the one institution on earth that the medieval world promised would be free of corruption, that was created specifically in response to the corruption of Rome to be its antithesis. And instead, 1,000 years later, it's become its twin, except even worse, because, this is supposed to be pure and perfect. This is supposed to be the answer to the other thing. So now we look around and we see similar things. How is it that the FDA is being run by, drug CEOs? How is it that the EPA is being run by CEOs of the most polluting corporations in the world? Every government agency we look at has been co-opted and turned into, through agency capture, and turned into the antithesis of what it claims to stand for. And when we look at our corporations, if we say, oh, that's just government, government's corrupt, and we look at our supposedly pure corporations that don't have that problem, that miasma that we accuse governance of having, then we find our corporations are corrupt too. Boeing makes planes that fall out of the sky. They're supposed to make planes that stay in the sky. Why do they exist if it's not to make an airplane that works, right? I mean, it is the fundamental corruption of its whole reason for existence. You see the same thing in universities that churn out people who are, incompetent to function in the world, but at least they paid their dues and the university was able to pocket that money and try to survive another year. It's like the reasons for things to exist are all corrupted. We can see it all around us. So we start asking these questions. So I'm gonna call on Abby in a second, but I want to bring this home to Sophrosune. What we see, the things that we're frustrated with, the ancients would say, are evidence that we're missing Sophrosune, that we're missing phronesis, that we're missing sophron, right? We don't know what the distinctive excellences are that our society needs to be cultivating in order to do a good job as a human society. We don't know our arites. We don't know even what the arites should be. And since we don't know what the arites should be, we can't evaluate our character. We can't know ourselves because we can't answer the question, how well did you do at the arites that are necessary for human survival? Well, we don't know what those are. We look at our character and we have no, I'm gonna use Phil's term, we have no way to measure it. We're lacking the frame of reference that would let us evaluate whether we've got good character or bad character. Since we don't know what our excellences are and we don't understand our own character, we also don't know what our hieris would be. What privileges to act do we have? What are the things that are within our circle of influence, where if we act in those areas, we can make a difference in the world? We don't know what those are. That's why so many people just say, fuck it, and they go into gamble and hope that they hit it big. Thus, we don't know the proper range of behavior for our way of life. We don't even know what our way of life should be. That means that we can't have sophron, because sophron is being conscious of your limits and being on guard, through phylactos, being on guard against overreaching your limits. To know what our limits are, we'd have to know where the target is, and we don't know that. For many of us, as they say, we shouldn't expect to have a career anymore. They started saying this in the 90s. So your jobs are just going to disappear every 10 years. You're going to have to start all over, go back to school, pick up a new career. People should expect to have 7 completely unrelated careers over the course of their lives now. Somebody like Sharon, the modern world says you can't exist anymore. The only anesthesiologists that should exist are anesthesiologists who've only been doing it for 10 years. And then they've got to run off and suddenly they've got to become a butcher who works in chopping up meat. And then after that, who knows what it's going to be? It's going to be some random thing resetting over and over and over. And that's the norm. Well, what are your limits? Right? What are the things you should do and what are the things you should not do when your whole life is constantly being upended over and over? The answer is the question isn't even answerable anymore. It's not just that we don't know where our limits are. It's not possible to have coherent limits anymore. People and I've been doing medical software for 40 years, but people can't get jobs today of the kind that I got in 1984 when I got hired by the VA. Those career ladders are gone. It's not possible to get onto a 40-year career ladder like that, the way that one used to be able to do. So without Sophron or Ethea or Hieros or Arete or Ethos, then likewise we have problems with phronesis and Sophrosune. Part of the reason that we can't define these terms is that there's no evidence of them in the world around us. So we assume that they must refer to something that is in the world around us. And that's why Wikipedia defines phronesis as practical intelligence. They can't imagine knowing what the healthy things are for a species to do, because we certainly don't know what those are. And since we imagine that we should be allowed to do anything because we're infinitely flexible, the concept that there's some unhealthy things we shouldn't do and some healthy things that we should do as a way of life sort of runs afoul of our core ideology as moderns. So we sort of disbelieve the concept of phronesis to begin with. We think if you dump us on Mars, if we're clever enough, we'll somehow make that work too. Throw us out into the middle of a vacuum. We'll just science our way to a solution. We'll be clever. We're nimble on our feet. We'll figure it out. It's like, no, you dump a person in a vacuum of space, and what happens is they die within a minute or two. That's what happens in the vacuum of space. There's no clevering your way out of that problem. There are numerous situations that are simply anathema to human life. We have to be pointing our species and our civilization away from those directions and towards the directions that give us the greatest possible chance of surviving. But none of that's what modernity is about, which is why we can't explain Sophrosune or phronesis. So if you want to put your hand up, Phil, go ahead, but I got to call on Abby first because she's had her hand up for a while. So Abby, come off mute, tell us what's on your mind.
Hi. So, excuse me. I understand the absence of phronesis and Sophrosune. Is that how you say it? Sophrosune?
Yeah, that's right.
Like on sort of a macro level, I feel like those are like things that kind of rise out of individualized or localized intimate understandings of ethos and arete and all these ethia, the ones that are like kind of before Sophron, phronesis, and Sophrosune.
Right.
But in a way, I feel like these other ones, the ethos and the ethia, can be like localized, like individualized,
Yes.
And so I guess because my mind keeps going to, okay, like we're painting this picture, which I think you make a very compelling argument that there really isn't, an organized feature in our society to, organize ourselves around. So like you said, even before when I asked my first question, it breeds this like nihilistic, like wandering basically that people are doing. But I wonder if there's ways that we can apply some of those earlier terms, like this understanding of our character on a like more individualized level, where maybe we don't have like the understanding of the character and our limitations as like atoms inside this matrix of everybody else, but maybe we do have them inside us, like as individuals, like to where we can cultivate those in a way, even in the modern society. Like, I guess there are examples of people doing this in very like perverse ways. Like, for example, you have influencers who like become like traditional families and they decide to go homestead, but really they're just like influencers online. So basically their influence, the whatever income they're getting from their influencer profile is then feeding this like lifestyle that they're projecting as like a traditional one, et cetera, et cetera. That is like a perversion of something. But I think like the core of that instinct to like display on the internet, you know, alternative ways of being, alternative ways of organizing yourself around certain principles that are more, you know, guided by something that maybe somebody like a Greek or a Roman would, you know, consider something like character, if that makes any sense. So the idea that there may be ways to carve out, you know, living situations locally, localized inside ourselves, maybe with our family members and friends, that are actively or acting in resistance to this like larger nihilistic wandering. And
Yes.
could that be a way to combat sort of some of this, you know, sad outcomes that have happened in modern times?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Certainly the purpose of this critique isn't to say everything's hopeless and there's nothing to be done. It's along the lines you're saying. It's to say, if we can rediscover the concept that there are some things that matter more than others, that there's some things we should be striving to do and other things that we should be striving not to do. If we can recreate a value system, especially if we can center it in the idea of the sacred, to say, as far as we know, there are some things that are deal breakers. We absolutely should not do those things, you know, and they've got to be stopped anytime that they happen. If we can start to reconstruct, you know, by studying nature, Zen Kata Fusin, then it's possible to begin rebuilding and making a culture. But as long as we think we already have a culture and everything's fine, we won't do that work because it's work, right? It's a little scary. And anytime you step out of the herd and start doing things differently from everybody else, you attract attention. And a lot of that attention is negative. A lot of people are very uncomfortable. If you start doing things differently, it calls into question what they're doing, and they don't want that. Hi, Teal, good to see you. It calls into question what they're doing, and they don't want to question what they're doing. So they figure the easiest way to resolve their existential angst is to stop you from doing it, because then you're not there to get to provide a bad example that makes them question things. So it's what makes this work. You know, you questioning your reflexes that you developed in the modern world, searching cultures for different ways to live, considering the long-term consequences of our actions when we're busy trying to pay our bills. You know, how do you carve away the time? You know, it's not to say it's impossible, but it's to say that it's work and potentially trouble. And everything in the modern world tries to prepare us to avoid both work and trouble. Right? Work smarter, not harder. That's the ethos of the marketplace, right? See if you can get other people to do the work for you, so that you don't have to work is kind of core to the thing. And likewise, don't attract attention, don't get in trouble is at the core of things. You know, it's even a lot of studies have been done of 1930s, 1940s in Germany under the Nazis. Why didn't the Germans rise up and overthrow the Nazis? Even the ones who disagreed with them. And there was a lot more resistance than we typically teach in history class, but a huge number of people just went along with it. And it's because Northern European countries did a good job of getting people to not want to get in trouble. Now, I have a friend who grew up in Italy, and she says, you know, the difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe is far bigger than Americans seem to understand. So Italians constantly get in trouble. They don't care. They'll argue with a cop. No problem. You know, they get together in the shops for coffee in the morning before work, and they sit down with their political opponents and they get into huge knockdown, drag out arguments about politics. Americans never do this. We prefer to get on the internet where nobody can actually reach out and slap us and make snide comments from a distance. The last thing in the world we want is to face confront somebody who believes the exact opposite of what we believe. But Italians do it every morning. This is just part of their life. They get into domestic squabbles, and they frequently break the law Because they're like, yeah, it's the law. Fuck the law. And she says, she went to Germany, and what's interesting about Germany? Things mostly work. People mostly don't run red lights left or right whenever they feel like it. The people have learned to obey. They follow the laws and they make a well-organized society. And she says, if you haven't actually spent a lot of time in Italy and then in Germany, if you're just like an American trying to guess what these countries are like, you'd never suspect how different they are. And what's happening in Germany is it's modernism, it's modernity. There is this strong belief that the most important virtue is to obey and to not get in trouble. So in order to do the things that you're talking about, which I agree we should be doing, and that's what we got to do. But in order to do those things, you have to be willing to cultivate an appetite for, what certain people in the civil rights movement said is good trouble. You have to be willing to get in trouble if it's for the right reason. You have to be willing to rock the boat. You got to be willing to bite the hand that feeds you, not gratuitously in order to show off, look at me and how fearless I am, like the Greeks who used to commit suicide publicly to say, see, I'm not afraid of death, but meaningfully, and say, okay, well, some of the things that I need to do are going to get me in trouble, and that's just how it's going to be, and all right. And it means that at least at first, it's always going to be a minority of people who are going to embark on the work to try to reconstruct a viable, healthy value system that one could build phronesis around. But it has to happen because this is just not sustainable.
Yeah, I totally see that. I had this thought, like maybe it's a little bit like Hegelian, but the idea that there's like a seed of what's to come, like in the fall of what's currently ending or whatever. And so I think perhaps there are people, maybe, people around us that are, embodying what something to come might look like a correct way of organizing yourself or whatever, or, the next iteration of a society that would come after one like ours, for example. Like perhaps there are people out there doing that stuff. It's just like, where are they? How do you identify them? And like, are they even, reachable? I guess.
Right. Yeah, a lot of people are going to get their hands on little pieces of the problem, and we're going to need to be talking to all of them. And a lot of it is just like, like the Zen kata fusin concept. A lot of it is we have to try things and be willing to acknowledge our failures. So something that might seem like a great idea, maybe we try it out and it falls flat on its face. We got to make sure that core to the new value system is then we talk about it. We don't cover it up or just scapegoat somebody else, or just stick to our guns and keep doing it no matter what. All of the modern solutions have to go away, and we have to replace that with, when something screws up, we have to accept the trouble, like science says you're supposed to do. Say, a failure is a result. You should document and talk about that result. It's important for people to know when our ideas aren't working, and that includes our new novel ideas. It's one of the ways of the many ways that Russia went wrong when it did its revolution in an attempt to escape modernity and move into what it imagined to be the successor system, is that it didn't want to admit its mistakes. This criticism happened within 5 years of the Russian Revolution. People who were anarchists who were living in Russia, who were very optimistic about it to begin with, started noticing things like, well, how come the people in the party are all living in the nice apartments, while meanwhile out in the streets there are orphans with no homes? Can't some of that money be put to make sure people aren't starving to death on the streets of Moscow? And what they were told was, shut up. This is right away. People are like, I don't want to talk about my mistakes. And in doing that, while trying to rebel against the current system, they're perpetuating it in another shape. Right? They come up with another way to continue the modern obsession with, I have to be innocent and not get in trouble, so I need to outsource my guilt to somebody else who I can scapegoat. That old recipe, that can't be part of any new world. And the only way that's ever going to stop is if people confront it, because only if that's dealt with directly are people going to be willing to admit when their ideas and ideologies, which are the great plague of modernity, are bullshit. As long as they keep covering up and rehabilitating their ideologies, they're not going to learn. They're not going to let anybody learn from their mistakes. So it's a very complicated thing, and it's going to take a long time, and it's not going to be able to happen in an artificial or heroic way. And it won't happen on our time frame. Lenin might have thought that, the 19 teens were a great time to move on to, whatever he imagined would come next. But, it wasn't up to him when it was a good time to move on to what came next. And so instead of doing what he thought he was doing, he did something else, which ended up coming around full circle back to capitalism, which was exactly what he thought he was trying to escape. Irony, man. History is just a fortune is a bitch. that's how the Greeks put it, right? 2K, do not trust 2K. The contingency really has it out for us sometimes. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I have a quick question. So as the Greeks set up their principles to govern their society, who held the aristoi? To whom were they accountable? And the reason I ask that, because I think in our society, I see the Supreme Court as a representation of aristoi in our society, but it is not, because they have a few practices and there's nobody to hold them accountable, or they resist accountability. And from that character flows the rest of society. So I want to know, when the Greeks were setting up their society, what system of accountability did they have?
Yeah, I mean, it's the right question. And, the short version of the answer is their ideas about who the aristoi should be were developed long after the aristoi as a class actually existed and was not composed of the people that they thought should be aristoi. Right? It was the conquerors who were in charge. The upper class of the conquerors, they dubbed themselves the aristoi, and that was the initial system. That's who initially got to be in charge. And it was only later that they said, some people who are in charge probably shouldn't be in charge because they have slavish character. Some of the people in charge are all just walking appetites and parochialisms, and other people who are in charge are walking ideologies, and none of those people should be in charge. Some of our aristoi aren't aristoi. In fact, a lot of our aristoi aren't aristoi. And effectively, that's Thucydides, although he doesn't use the words per se, that's Thucydides' critique of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. He says the character of Athens, and Donald points this out, Thucydides' argument is the character of Athens itself has been corrupted. It doesn't have the character it once had, or that it aspired to have. And you can see it through the actions that it's taking in the war, right? Because everything we do is a reflection of our character. We're acting out the impulses, the drives from within our character. So, when Athens, kills all the men in a city and rapes all the women and sells the women and children into slavery and burns the place to the ground, that's not using patho, persuasion, which Athens said was its great virtue above all the other city-states, that it didn't rule through brutal force, but it ruled through persuasion. And here they are acting out the exact opposite and demonstrating that that's not who they are. So for the ancient Greeks, this is one of their challenges is even aside from the question of accountability, which would add another layer of protection on top of it, even coming out of the starting gate, they didn't have the right people in charge. It was hit or miss whether the king or the aristocracy or the demos were actually aristoi or not. And that schism between what we claim we're doing and what we say we ought to do on the one hand, and then on the other hand, what are we actually doing, is what Augustine is criticizing in Rome in his book, The City of God. You say you're going to be ruled by excellence of character, but what I see is walking, talking appetites and ideologies. So you are not being true to your own, you've corrupted your own value system. And therefore it proves that your value system is corruptible. And we want to leave it behind for something incorruptible. So we choose God. And thus the medieval era is born. I mean, these are serious problems you're asking. And of course, it goes to that classic Roman formulation. Who watches the watchman? How are you going to hold your aristoi accountable? And I think the short answer is nobody solved that problem yet. Nobody solved that problem.
We're living through it. We're living through it now.
We're living through it.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's exactly the right question. That's the question that human affairs needs to address. How do you hold governance accountable for what it does? And the current answer is we're not even trying to. So you can't look to us for a solution. What we would say, what a modern would say at our best is we would put in place a system of checks and balances that would correct any deficiencies in the governance. In fact, we claim to have that system. But it was my stepmom who was the first person in the United States to do a retrospective, complete study of every budget ever passed by the United States since its founding, and studied between Congress and the executive who was for it and who was against it. And given that, who won? And her study basically proved that we've never had checks and balances. We've always had an oversized executive who almost always wins those battles. There's a few times when they don't, but they almost always do. So, and of course, the current Supreme Court's solution to these problems is the executive should be made even stronger. Let us put our thumb even further in the direction of the imbalance that has plagued us from the beginning. So this is the problem with all modern solutions, is that you can't make a system that's so foolproof that a fool can't find a way to sabotage the system. If we've proven anything in 200 years, it's that. All of our systems are eminently corruptible. Systems by their nature are corruptible because, kind of to use the terminology that Abby was using earlier on the call, we don't hold anything sacred. So there's no system that you can make that somebody doesn't feel they have a perfect right to corrupt. Right? They don't actually, the laws just becomes this thing that we do a tug of war over so that we can dominate each other, and it all becomes might makes right. So it's clear that the answer to these problems doesn't lie within a continuation of these amoral, nihilistic, kind of sacred averse systems. Something's going to have to be held sacred before we can make something that's less corruptible than what we have. Because we just regularly buy and sell what we have right now, right? I mean, every politician's for sale, we know. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, well, they've bribed the people checking them to say yes. What I'm going to say, and the thing that concerns me, going through a few of these Zoom groups, is you encounter a lot of rhubarb and a lot of waffle. And I think what I've learned about studying philosophy is that studying it means pain. It hurts. Well, even these Kenneth Smith documents, it hurts your head. And what I've noticed about most of the people that want to do this stuff, they want to have an easy ride. I think you're making the point about the Aristos, that in the ancient cultures, they put the candidates through experiences that weren't easy, like the Spartans. They had very tough punishments, tossed a guy out in the wilderness, and he could only survive by breaking the law. And he learned the greater law is break the law but never get caught. And this is a bit like that Star Trek movie where they have the the Kobayashi Maru trick. And, the officer says, "This isn't logical, you can't win." Kirk says, "That's the entire point. How are you going to react when you're in an impossible situation?" It's a test of character. And I'm just really disappointed at the sort of attitudes when people say to me that, well, you're just making things difficult. But it's supposed to be difficult. It isn't supposed to be easy. If you just want a cruisy job, if you just want a cruisy philosophy trip, you're not going to change yourself, because cruising along is all about just going with your inclinations and with the sentiments you already have and not reviewing those. They'll complain. One guy was complaining, well, you don't seem to have any ideals. To them, philosophy was having a set of beliefs or a set of ideals. And I said, the problem is all the beliefs I had and all the ideals I had, I discovered just don't work. So I have to go back to basics and find out within myself why I hold opinions that don't work. That's the bigger question. They don't see that. And this is all over the place. There's something not going right in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the ways to distinguish fake philosophy from real philosophy, is that fake philosophy is about developing a set of tools that you then use against other people's ideas and arguments. But the whole point of real philosophy is to use them against your own arguments and ideas, because you're the one that's stuck in the trap of your own worldview. It doesn't do you any good to dismantle other people's worldviews and then stay stuck in your own. Right? It's like this is the core of tragedy. Until Oedipus can shatter the envelope that's causing him to misinterpret his situation, he can't even understand what situation he's in. He doesn't have a chance to make things better. Everything he does can only make things worse because he's looking at it the wrong way. So if the whole, as Kenneth Smith says, every other subject gives you something new to think about. Only philosophy gives you something new to think with. And it does that by painfully, like Agamemnon, drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain. Pathe mathos, it breaks up our comfortable presuppositions and forces us to reevaluate our entire lives and how we've been seeing the world. I'm with you. And you hardly ever see it. I mean, in pop culture, it's called waffling. It's called being indecisive, overthinking. That's what they call those things, right? Philosophy is for losers. Where winners are confident people. They charge forth and they do the right thing and they win because they're winners. This is the core value system of modernity. And cartoon as it is, but that's what who can get the most votes and who can get the most money comes down to. It's like, winners win. It's a tautology. And it's, as David's pointed out before, that aversion to philosophical discourse, that demand that philosophy justify itself in terms of winning and losing, that's, if anything, the core signature of barbarism. That's how you know you're living in a barbaric era, is when, like the ancient Roman era, it considers, philosophy anathema and for weaklings, because who wants to question themselves? Who wants to undergo the pain? They think they're being brave by avoiding philosophy, but they're being cowards. They don't want to hurt the way that you have to hurt in order to question your beliefs. And, we do. So, yes. Hooray, we get to hurt. So, James, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Would you say that the modern philosophies of pragmatism and, the important, you can define phronesis as a kind of practical wisdom. Is that the dominant philosophy in the modern age? I mean, the most important philosopher sounds like, according to Google, it's Wittgenstein, right? And his philosophy is, uselessness.
Yeah.
Uselessness of language. Also Heidegger as well, very, very compatible with Wittgenstein. He allows for some philosophy, but, most important thing is to, be in that readiness to hand state where you can, use a hammer without thinking.
Yes.
And
it's the great question you're asking.
Right. So is that the kind of, practical philosophy that is dominant that you're talking about? I mean, he places a lot of importance on care, but you can also care about the wrong things, right?
Yes.
Right. So
yes, Kenneth would love this question. I'm sorry he's not here today. This is the core of modernity, and its antipathy to philosophy, which is you shouldn't worry your head about worrying about what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. You should just worry about how to win. How can you usefully achieve the thing that you want to achieve? If you want to round up all the Jews and put them in death camps and burn them all to death, gas them and burn them all to death, philosophy, that worrying about whether you're doing the wrong thing or the right thing, that's for losers and weaklings. The modern philosophy is just worry about how to do it efficiently. Kill as many people as you can, as fast as you can. If that's what you want, you should succeed at it. Pragmatism is about how to succeed at the things you want to do and how not to question whether that's a good thing to want. This is modernity in a nutshell, right? How do you win? That's why it's focused on usefulness. How do you increase your power to carry out what you will to do? That's pragmatism. And it's an anti-philosophy because it argues that anything that distracts you from succeeding at your goals is a problem. Whereas philosophy, especially existentialist philosophy of the ancient Greek variety, argues that it is your desires that are often the problem. Doing them more effectively is usually just makes things worse, right? You're stuck in a hole, you need to get out, but you think the solution is to dig the hole more effectively. This is pragmatism. I just need a bigger shovel. If I get a big enough shovel, I'll really make the dirt fly. It's like, yeah, but your problem is you're pointing into the ground. You don't need pragmatism. You need philosophy to say, I wonder if digging this hole deeper will ever get me out of the hole. This is what philosophy asks us. I wonder if it's just hideously evil to round up all the Jews and gas them. Maybe I should question my objectives. The antipathy to philosophy in Germany, that central pragmatism is what led them to be willing to do anything to win, to succeed. And they prided themselves on it. Just like the ancient Romans prided themselves on it. It's like that power. We have the powerful will. Look at our overbearing, dominant will. That's why we're the greatest country in the world. Deutschland über alles. I mean, that whole thing was built around that idea of pragmatism. You just have to be powerful enough and focused enough on winning, and then you'll be a winner. And I agree. And Kenneth would say that is the dominant philosophy. You see it everywhere. Just try harder. Just make more money. Just collect more votes. Just win. I'm watching the Olympics, and it's fascinating to hear the difference between the commentators who actually did the sport that's being commentated upon and the commentators who are the sort of storytelling, entertaining narrative guys, because the narrative guys are constantly, shifting into the who's winning and who's losing horse race game. Whereas the ones who actually did it before will actually talk about how hard it is to discipline yourself and learn to be excellent. And when someone fails, they'll often say, "Oh, that's not a big deal. He'll do better next time." You could see, there's a moment that happens when you have to commit to the jump, and it's part of your training that you can get there like 98% of the time, but 2% of the time your body panics and says, "Nope, I'm not doing it." And it happens to everybody. He's not a loser because he did that. It could happen to any of us. It will happen to us sooner or later. And the main storyteller commentator is all scratching his head going, but winners win and losers lose. You can hear he can't deal with the non-pragmatic, pursuit of excellence, philosophical approach to developing the skills. And that clash between pragmatism and sort of everything it takes to live and excel, it's everywhere in our society. You're right, James. I mean, it's that pragmatism it's the dominant way of making these decisions, and it drives out kind of deeper introspection in our society. It's why we do the things we do, no matter how much it hurts us. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to go back to what Donald brought up first about the Republic, about Socrates descending to Piraeus to celebrate the gods, in this case, the foreign gods. And the first question you should ask is, why is he descending? Because Athens is really three cities, right? There's Piraeus, there's Athens, and there's the Acropolis. Why isn't he ascending to the Acropolis to light a fire to Athena instead of descending down to Piraeus? And my thought is, there's really a kind of funny parallelism between that and modern society, because we're so caught up in the market structure. It seems to me the whole idea about Piraeus was, and I guess the Greeks, that was the turn, that in a sense they could take advantage of Piraeus. And in a sense, because they have Athens has a powerful navy, and they could essentially start a war. And if they were blockaded under siege, they could always sail the ships to get all the supplies and win. There's no way. So what you do is you build a wall around the city, which they have, and then you build the wall down to Piraeus to protect Piraeus, so it becomes part of that. And it seems interesting that Socrates descended to Piraeus And it was the place in which brought in the supplies to the emergence of the market, right? And the irony of that is that didn't Socrates teach at the Agora, which is the marketplace? So the philosophical place turned into the marketing place, right? From the supplies and the wealth that's brought in to Piraeus and I guess ascended to Athens into the Agora. And so they could be a wealthy city. I mean, wealth rule. That seems a lot like what we're doing, what we have been doing, actually. We have a large navy that could sail to far off lands and protect the ships that bring the wealth to this country in a way. I'm sure that other countries are doing the same thing, but we have the bigger navy. We have the aircraft carriers that would destroy any country. Apparently, one super carrier has more firepower in terms of the Air Force than only four countries, and one of them is the United States. So there's only 3 other countries that one aircraft carrier does not have more of an Air Force than 3 other countries in the world. So in some sense, it sounds like a repetition.
Yes.
So that we are control in the marketplace rather than in a sense in a democratic ideal. So that's become the fundamental thing. And that was the turn that turned Athens into this marketing structure, the wealthy state, right? Rather than in the sense, the philosophical state. And so I thought that was a very interesting parallelism. I thought I would bring that up so Donald could comment on
it. You saw Donald's hand up and you're like, ooh, let's prime the pump. Thank you, Phil. That's a good one. Yeah, I mean, it's striking that the ancient there's 2 things Kenneth Smith says about how the Greeks thought about wealth in their traditional culture, not their later logos culture, which was corrupted by the marketplace, but the earlier culture. One of them is that, Plautos, which is wealth, and Pluto, the Roman name for Hades, are related to each other. And even in the Greek religion, Hades was not only the god of souls, which is where all souls eventually went, but also the god of of the wealth that lies within the earth underground. And that idea that death and wealth are intimately related to each other was something the ancient Greeks took very seriously. The other thing is, Kenneth Smith says, people all know that you're supposed to give an obol to Charon before you're allowed to cross the river Styx into the underworld, but they don't ask themselves why. And, it's not because he's a shop vendor. He's not a vending machine. It's because they gave their last obol, the last of their wealth, they handed over to the god of wealth, because in death, none of that was going to matter. Only a fool would want to stay connected to stupid things like money that maybe mattered in life, but absolutely don't matter when it comes down to it.
Hey, just a quick comment. I think one of the main characters, well, not the main character, but one of the first character they have a dialogue with, I forgot his name, but he was a wealthy man because he's made a lot of money dealing with arms. Cephalus, okay. So that's interesting too. The arms made a lot of money.
Yes, money and death. Thank you, Phil. Donald, come up. You get the final word.
I hope not. I wanted to say to Sharon, but that the Greeks struggled with this problem, and they're perhaps they were not quite to the point where we were of the idea of a constitutional organization, but they did codify their laws. And they had, one of the problems they had was they wanted laws that were unchangeable, and yet they were also somewhat just majoritarian, that you couldn't stop. It was hard to stop the majority, and they had two mechanisms that I'm familiar with. One, ostracism. 10 years, you're out. We don't kill you. We don't take your property. We don't impoverish you, but you got to go live somewhere else because you're a disruptive force. And they would pass laws saying you couldn't change other laws, which didn't work. So both of these, I think, come from my reading of M.I. Finley, his work on economics and law, a great book. And we think of democratic, but Athens struggled with tyranny too. There've been the Pisistratus family. There was a lot of bad people got in charge in Athens too. And that somewhat at the end became a symbol. Were you one of the ones that helped slay the 30? Even that, which was the oligarchy put in by Sparta after Athens was defeated, and Athens regained its democracy, but you had to kind of show you were on that side. You needed to kill people. It's like Germany, France, who was in the resistance, in France, who didn't get their head shaved and stuff like that. Anyway, but I think not only do the parallels that Phil pointed out, but this majority being a democratic and having it veer towards majoritarianism and democratic with a constitution, but the majoritarianism can destroy constitutionalism. And majoritarianism is a kind of, well, most of the Greek people that thought about this, Aristotle or Plato, this was democracy could be mobocracy at the hands of the demagogues. The idea was stirring up things for the wrong reasons or for invalid reasons. And in some of what we talked about today, you see a lot of that where you now have philosophy like form and content, being and appearance, because the sophist learned how to take on the appearance of the philosopher, to use the techniques of the orator to become the demagogue. It produced a lot of thought, whatever. Anyway, that's enough. That's enough. But Phil is a lot about the Republic. It's a book that you can read, as I said at the very beginning. It's a book you can read over and over and over. But we also talked a little bit about, like, you also see the difference why Kenneth says Aristotle was far more an existentialist, in that he would say in his political works, let's compare all the existing political systems and make judgments.
Right.
And Plato might say, how do we create a yardstick, a ruler by which we can measure existing political systems to know what characteristics would be desirable, which ones were good. This I think James, I don't know if James is still on, but one of the things with pragmatism is that it's fundamentally circular.
Right.
We want to do what works, but we never go to that question of how do we decide what works. We just spit. It's a way to avoid the question posed by the Greeks, or at least posed by philosophical Greeks, even ones that we disagree with, perhaps, and that could be Aristotle or Plato or whatever. But I think there's a lot of consensus in Greek thought that you have to know this sophrosune. You have to know your own nature, the nature of the cosmos, how you fit in order to choose wisely. Oh, it's like a Monty Python movie. You have chosen wisely. But that is all of life right there. How to choose wisely. And pragmatism never gets there. They like to come one step to it and then go in a circle from then on.
You're like, let's skip the choosing and wise part and let's just get to how do I get what I want.
Right, without examining the want.
Right.
And not even learning from the wants about ourselves. Wanting, if reflected upon, can be part of knowing thyself. Of course, it can also be part of blinding oneself too. Well,
yeah, we'll wrap up, but maybe that thing about wanting, all of Agamemnon by Aeschylus hinges on that. Why did Clytemnestra do the wrong thing? Why is it so wrong to kill this guy who murdered her daughter? And Cornford points out that Aeschylus basically says she was fine as long as she was being possessed by the spirit of justice, right? That he had to be punished for this terrible thing he did. Said, but the problem was there came the moment where she wanted to lick the blood off of her fingers, where she's like, fuck justice. I just want to hurt this bastard. I hate him so much. I just hate him. And she became the spirit of, hatred and violence and bloodlust. And then there's a moment where she catches herself and goes, uh-oh. I appear to have missed the mark. And that sets in motion the rest of the plays in the series. It's like, it's one thing to try to do something to bring justice in the world. It's something else to do it because you're just so angry.
It makes you think. People who don't have time for philosophy should read like Aeschylus and Shakespeare, and just read them over and over and over.
Some of it'll sink in.
And see if they come to understand human nature in the characters of the plays and then themselves.
Yes.
If they can see themselves in those characters, they will have come a long way, go a long way towards some wisdom.
Yes. Well, we've come a long way today. Thank you all. I hope you had as good a time as I did. I really enjoyed our session, and I'm looking forward to next Monday when we'll pick this up and run with it some more. Have a great week, everyone.